His dog dug beside the barn and uncovered proof that the man who gave him the farm had been waiting for him to fail. A homeless Navy SEAL got a deserted farm for free. His dog found what was buried by the barn. Ethan Walker arrived in Montana with $143, a dying pickup, and Atlas, the K9 who had carried him through his darkest nights. The farm was supposed to be worthless, but when Atlas gave an old military alert behind the barn, Ethan uncovered a secret powerful men had spent decades burying. Would you stay and uncover the truth? Comment 1 for yes or 0 for no, and tell us where you're watching from. By the time Ethan Walker saw the weathered sign for Pine Hollow, Montana, the fuel gauge had been resting on empty for 19 miles. He kept one hand loose on the steering wheel and listened to the old pickup complain its way up the final grade. The engine coughed whenever he asked too much of it. Something beneath the hood had been ticking since Idaho, and the passenger side window was held closed with silver tape. Beside him, Atlas slept with his muzzle across his paws. The German Shepherd was 9 now. Gray had begun spreading around his muzzle, but there was still something unmistakably military in the way he rested. Even asleep, one ear remained angled toward Ethan. Ethan understood. He slept the same way. The Bitterroot Mountains rose ahead of them, dark green at their bases and broken with stone near the peaks. Pine Hollow occupied a narrow valley below, a scattering of roofs, grain silos, barns, and church steeples surrounded by miles of pasture. It looked peaceful. Ethan had learned not to trust peaceful from a distance. He pulled into a gas station and counted the money in his wallet. $143. That was everything. Not emergency money, not spending money, everything. Behind the seat were 2 shirts, 3 pairs of socks, an old field jacket, shaving gear, Atlas's food, a sleeping bag, and a wooden box containing the medals Ethan had not looked at in 4 years. 3 years earlier, he'd had an apartment outside Tacoma. Then came the missed shifts, the construction jobs that lasted weeks instead of months. The nights when a dropped tool or backfiring truck could turn an ordinary afternoon into somewhere else entirely. Eventually there had been motels, then shelters, then the truck. Through every address and every lost address, Atlas stayed. Ethan put $20 of gas in the tank. That left $123. He stared at the bills before closing his wallet. Living large, he murmured. Atlas opened one brown eye. Ethan almost smiled. They drove into Pine Hollow just before noon. The town had one main street lined with brick storefronts, hanging flower baskets, pickup trucks, and cottonwoods whose leaves flashed silver whenever the mountain wind turned them over. Ethan stopped at a diner because the handwritten sign advertised eggs, potatoes, and coffee for $6. He chose the booth farthest from the door. Old habit. Atlas settled beneath the table. For the first 5 minutes, everything was fine. Then a ranch crew came in, 6 men, heavy boots, loud voices, chairs scraping. A waitress dropped a metal tray near the kitchen. The crash was harmless. Ethan's body didn't care. His shoulders locked. His eyes found the exits before he consciously told them to. Front door, kitchen, hallway beside the restrooms. His hearing narrowed. Forks against plates became sharp little impacts. Someone behind him laughed too loudly. The room suddenly felt smaller. His coffee cup trembled almost imperceptibly against the saucer. Then something warm pressed firmly against his shin. Atlas. The dog stood beneath the table and leaned his entire shoulder into Ethan's leg. Ethan looked down. Atlas looked back. Present, here. Pine Hollow. Diner. Coffee. No threat. Ethan slowly opened the hand he hadn't realized he'd clenched. Good boy. Atlas remained against him. Ethan left $12 on the table despite having eaten only half his breakfast. Outside, mountain air hit his face. He stood beside the pickup until his breathing settled. Nobody followed. Nobody asked questions. Atlas sat against his knee. I'm fine, Ethan said. Atlas stared at him. Yeah, I know. Across the street stood the county administration building. Ethan had seen a notice for seasonal maintenance work there when he'd stopped at a library 2 towns back. Work meant fuel. Fuel meant another week. He crossed the street. Inside, a receptionist directed him upstairs to Richard Caldwell. Caldwell was 58, silver-haired, clean-shaven, and dressed like a man who never needed to check his bank balance before ordering lunch. He read Ethan's application. Construction, mostly. Military? Ethan hesitated. Navy, Caldwell noticed the hesitation and didn't push. There's not much county work right now. Ethan nodded once. He'd heard versions of that sentence everywhere from Oregon to Wyoming. He stood. Thanks for your time, Mr. Walker. Ethan stopped. Caldwell leaned back. What would you say if I had something other than a job? Ethan remained standing. Depends what it is. A farm. That got his attention. Caldwell pulled a file from the cabinet. 96 acres, about 7 miles northwest of town. House, barn, pasture, timber along the western ridge. And what's wrong with it? Caldwell smiled faintly. You don't waste time. Nobody gives away 96 acres because it's perfect. The owner died 7 years ago. Samuel Grady. No heirs successfully claimed it. Taxes accumulated. The county tried auctioning it. Twice. No qualified buyer followed through. He opened the folder. The state has a rehabilitation provision for distressed rural property. Occupy it continuously for 12 months. Bring the residents to minimum habitability. Maintain the land. Pay the filing and administrative fees. Complete the requirements. And you can petition for title. Ethan stared at him. How much, today? Caldwell rotated a paper toward him. $1 filing fee. Ethan almost laughed. Instead, he looked harder. What's the catch? A voice answered from the doorway. The catch is Grady's place. Ethan turned. The man standing there was broad-shouldered, perhaps early 50s, wearing a dark ranch coat despite the warm day. His boots were expensive but carried real mud. His face had the weathered hardness of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Caldwell's expression tightened. Travis, Richard. The man's eyes moved to Ethan, then Atlas. You're giving him Grady's farm? Mr. Walker qualifies for the program. Travis Mercer gave a short, humorless laugh. Of course he does. Ethan said nothing. Mercer stepped into the office. I own cattle land north of Grady's place. So here's some free advice. Don't take it. Why? Bad well, bad fences, roof leaks. Barns one winter from becoming firewood. Anything else? Mercer studied him. Grady spent 35 years fighting that land. In the end, it beat him. Everybody who's tried staying there since has lasted a few months, Caldwell interrupted. That's enough. Mercer's eyes remained on Ethan. You're passing through, right? Ethan's jaw tightened. He recognized the tone. He had heard it from motel clerks watching his old truck. Employers noticing the address on an application was a shelter. Men who saw everything he owned behind one bench seat and understood immediately how far he had fallen. Mercer glanced through the window at Ethan's battered pickup. Keep passing. Ethan felt the old familiar humiliation rise hot behind his ribs. Then Atlas stood, not aggressively. He simply moved beside Ethan, solid, patient. There, Ethan looked down at him, 9 years old, gray around the muzzle, still standing watch. Ethan turned back toward Caldwell. Show me where to sign. Mercer's expression changed. Not amusement this time, something closer to concern. Caldwell placed the rehabilitation agreement on the desk. Ethan read every page. 12 months of continuous occupancy, minimum repairs, basic land maintenance, no unauthorized sale or transfer during the rehabilitation period. He reached the final page. For almost 3 years, paperwork had meant losing something. Eviction notices, employment termination, shelter intake forms, bills he couldn't pay, documents explaining politely that whatever place he had occupied yesterday was no longer his tomorrow. Now there was a key lying beside this one. Ethan took the pen, he signed, Caldwell stamped the document and slid a brass key across the desk. "Congratulations, Mr. Walker." Ethan picked it up. The little piece of metal felt strangely heavy. Mercer stood near the doorway. "You don't know what you're taking." Ethan folded his copy of the agreement. "No." He put it carefully inside his jacket. "But I know what I'm leaving." For once, Mercer had no answer. 20 minutes later, Ethan's pickup rolled out of Pine Hollow with Atlas beside him and directions to a farm neither of them had ever seen. The mountains opened ahead. Sunlight moved across the valley in broad golden bands. Ethan rested one hand against the folded agreement inside his jacket just to make sure it was real. A place, maybe only for 12 months, maybe a wreck, maybe another mistake, but nobody was asking him to leave it tonight. That alone felt dangerously close to hope. Behind them on the second floor of the county building, Richard Caldwell stood at his office window until the old pickup disappeared beyond the cottonwoods. His pleasant expression was gone. He closed the office door, then he took a phone from his desk and dialed a number from memory. Someone answered. Caldwell kept his voice low. Someone finally took Grady's place. He listened to the response. His eyes shifted toward the distant Bitterroot Mountains. Then he slowly closed the blinds. 7 miles away, Ethan Walker knew nothing about the phone call. He was too busy trying to keep his new farm from shaking his truck apart. The paved county road had narrowed to gravel 2 miles outside Pine Hollow, then to twin tracks running through yellow grass and scattered lodgepole pine. Dust rolled behind the pickup in a long brown ribbon. Atlas had stopped sleeping. He sat upright in the passenger seat, ears forward, studying every fence post and tree line they passed. "New territory," Ethan said. Atlas glanced at him. "Yeah, mine too." The word felt strange. Mine. Ethan wasn't ready to use it for the farm. Not yet. They crossed a narrow wooden bridge over a shallow creek and climbed toward the foothills. The Bitterroots filled the western horizon now, their upper ridges purple beneath the lowering sun. Beyond a stand of cottonwoods, Ethan finally saw an old mailbox leaning toward the road. Grady. The letters had nearly faded away. A rusted gate sagged beside it. Ethan stopped the truck. For several seconds, neither he nor Atlas moved. Then Ethan opened his door. "Let's see what $1 buys." Atlas jumped down. The German shepherd immediately lowered his nose and began reading 7 years of abandoned ground. Ethan pushed the gate open with both hands. The hinges screamed. Beyond it stretched 96 acres of neglect. The pasture had gone wild. Waist-high grass rolled toward the foothills, broken by thistles and young pine. An old tractor sat half buried in weeds. Fence rails leaned at drunken angles. The farmhouse stood on slightly higher ground, a 2-story structure once painted white. Most of the paint had peeled away, leaving gray boards exposed beneath it. One porch column had shifted, 2 windows were broken, and beyond the house stood the barn. It was enormous. Dark timber, weather-beaten boards, a roofline sagging slightly in the middle. The evening sun burned behind it, turning every gap in the siding into a narrow blade of orange light. Ethan stared. Mercer wasn't exaggerating. Atlas sneezed in the dust. Helpful, they drove to the house. The truck died the moment Ethan switched it off. When he tried restarting it, the engine clicked once. Nothing more. Ethan rested his forehead briefly against the steering wheel. Perfect. Atlas was already waiting outside. Ethan laughed softly despite himself. "Fine. We live here now." The brass key Caldwell had given him barely fit the front lock. Ethan worked it carefully until something gave with a dry, metallic snap. The door opened inward. The smell came first. Dust, old wood, mouse nests, cold ashes, a house closed too long. Ethan remained at the threshold while his eyes adjusted. A faded couch sat beneath a sheet. An iron stove occupied one corner. A kitchen table stood beneath the window with one chair still pulled away, as though Samuel Grady had gotten up 7 years earlier and simply never returned. Atlas stepped inside. He moved room to room while Ethan followed. Kitchen, pantry, small downstairs bedroom, stairs, 2 bedrooms above. Everywhere were traces of a life interrupted rather than packed away. A work jacket hung behind the kitchen door. An enamel coffee cup sat upside down beside the sink. A pair of reading glasses rested on a newspaper so old the paper had yellowed almost brown. Ethan touched nothing. He knew something about abandoned lives. People imagined homelessness meant owning nothing. That wasn't quite true. It meant constantly deciding which pieces of your life you could afford to keep carrying. Samuel Grady had never been forced to make that choice. Everything was still here, yet the man wasn't. Ethan looked around the silent kitchen. Guess we both inherited somebody else's leftovers. Atlas stood in the doorway. His tail moved once. Ethan unloaded before dark. Sleeping bag, dog food, toolbox, water, clothes. The wooden metal box remained behind the truck seat. He left it there. Some things weren't ready to enter a house. He found enough dry wood stacked beneath the porch to start a small fire in the iron stove. The chimney drew after coughing smoke into the room for several minutes. Atlas ate beside the kitchen table. Ethan ate crackers and canned beans directly from the tin. No television, no traffic, no voices through motel walls, no footsteps outside a shelter bunk, only the stove ticking as it warmed and the mountain wind moving around the house. For a while, Ethan simply listened. Silence used to be part of his profession. There were nights overseas when silence meant concentration, patience, men trusting one another enough not to speak. After coming home, silence changed. It became the space where memories waited. But this silence felt different. It contained crickets, timber settling, Atlas drinking water, a creek somewhere below the pasture. Ethan spread his sleeping bag on the living room floor. Atlas circled twice and settled near the front door. Still taking first watch? The dog lowered his head. Ethan turned off the lantern. Darkness filled the farmhouse. For several hours, he slept. Then the wind changed. It came down hard from the mountains after midnight. Something loose on the roof lifted. Bang! Ethan's eyes opened. Bang! His body moved before his mind did. He rolled away from the sleeping bag, one hand reaching toward his waist. Nothing there. Another metallic crash ripped across the roof, and suddenly the farmhouse disappeared. For one terrible second, Ethan smelled hot dust instead of pine. He heard rotor wash that wasn't there. His pulse hammered. He couldn't place the room, couldn't find the door. His hand searched the darkness for a weapon years removed from his life. Then 80 pounds of German Shepherd struck him gently from the side. Atlas pressed across Ethan's chest. Ethan sucked in a breath. The dog stayed. Another sheet of roofing slammed outside. Ethan flinched. Atlas pushed harder. Warm fur, steady breathing, a familiar weight. Ethan put both hands against Atlas's shoulders. Atlas. The dog's ears shifted. Atlas. His own voice sounded distant. He forced himself to name what was real. Farmhouse. Atlas watched him. Montana, another breath. Pine Hollow, the room slowly returned. Wood floor, cold stove, moonlight through broken glass. Atlas, no desert, no mission, no one waiting for him to make the right decision in 5 seconds. Ethan lowered his forehead against the dog's neck. I'm here. Atlas remained against him until Ethan's breathing slowed. Neither of them slept much afterward. At sunrise, Ethan found the problem. A strip of corrugated metal had pulled loose over the porch roof. He stared up at it with a hammer in his hand. There were larger problems everywhere. Broken windows, damaged steps, fence line, well pump, barn, truck, money, 12 months. For an instant, the list became so large that he felt the old instinct rising. Leave before failure chooses for you. Then Atlas walked past, carrying a rotten piece of porch wood in his mouth. Ethan looked at him. That's not helping. Atlas dropped it at his feet. Ethan examined the board, then the broken step. He almost smiled. One thing at a time, Atlas panted. So Ethan chose the downstairs window. He removed the broken glass, measured the opening, and cut a temporary patch from plywood he found in Grady's shed. One job, then another. He secured the roof metal, cleared mouse nests from the pantry, got the hand pump beside the kitchen sink moving enough to produce brown water, then decided they would use bottled water until he understood the well. By afternoon, sweat had soaked through his shirt. His hands hurt. He hadn't thought about leaving once. That realization stopped him more completely than exhaustion did. He stood on the porch looking across the pasture. Atlas lay in the shade. The dog had spent the day patrolling between the house, fence, barn, and creek, as though somebody had finally assigned him a post again. Maybe that was what Ethan needed too. Not a grand purpose, not redemption, just something broken enough to require him tomorrow. Near sunset, Ethan cooked a little rice with canned chicken and gave Atlas his share after it cooled. Then they walked the property. It was an old routine from another life. Inspect the perimeter before darkness. They followed the fence north, crossed near the creek, then turned back toward the house as shadows stretched from the mountains. Atlas moved ahead. Ethan watched the dog with quiet affection. Not bad, huh? Atlas continued toward the barn. Roof's ugly. Company isn't much. The dog suddenly stopped. Ethan took 2 more steps before noticing. Atlas? No movement. The German shepherd stood behind the barn near the stone foundation. His ears were forward, tail still, head lowered. Ethan's expression changed. He knew that posture. He hadn't seen it in years. Atlas. The dog ignored the surrounding field. His nose moved slowly across one patch of hard earth. Once, twice. Then Atlas froze. Every muscle became still. Ethan approached carefully. Show me. Atlas sniffed again. He moved 6 inches to the left, stopped, then sat, not casually, not because he was tired. It was an alert, clean, deliberate, professional. Ethan looked at the ground. Nothing. Dry soil, sparse grass, a few stones, no hole, no tracks he could identify in the fading light. He crouched and touched the earth. Cold, hard, ordinary. What do you have? Atlas stared at him. For the first time since they arrived, the farm's silence no longer felt peaceful. Ethan looked toward the dark barn towering over them, then back at the patch of ground beneath his hand. Atlas did not move. Whatever had brought the old working dog out of retirement was still there, under the earth. Ethan remained crouched behind the barn until the last orange light disappeared from the mountains. Atlas never broke his alert. That bothered Ethan more than anything. The dog was curious about plenty of things: rabbits, deer tracks, the mice currently conducting unauthorized operations inside Samuel Grady's farmhouse. This was different. Atlas had been trained to communicate with precision. When he sat like this, body still and eyes fixed on Ethan, he wasn't asking permission to chase something. He was reporting. Ethan swept his flashlight across the ground. The patch measured perhaps 6 feet by 4. Hard soil, thin grass, a few flat stones embedded near the barn foundation. He smelled the air himself. Nothing unusual, all right. He touched Atlas behind the ear. Leave it. Atlas stood immediately. They returned to the farmhouse, but halfway there, Ethan looked back. The barn was almost invisible now. Nothing but a black shape beneath a sky filling with stars. For some reason, he had the uncomfortable feeling it was looking back. The next morning, Atlas returned to that same place. So did Ethan. In daylight, he examined it properly. First, he checked for an animal burrow. Nothing. Then drainage. The ground sloped gently away from the barn, which made a natural depression unlikely. He searched for fuel stains from old machinery. Nothing obvious. He found no exposed pipe, no recent tire impressions, and no sign that livestock had been buried there. Yet Atlas sniffed slowly along the edge, turned, and sat. Same spot, same alert. Ethan folded his arms. What am I missing? Atlas offered no explanation. Ethan walked around the barn instead. The building was worse up close. Its north wall leaned several inches. Sunlight entered through gaps between boards. Inside were 3 stalls, an old workbench, broken harness pieces, feed bins, and machinery, so rusted it seemed to be returning to the earth. Ethan stepped carefully. The smell was dry timber, hay dust, mouse droppings, leather, and old iron. Atlas followed. Near the center aisle, the dog paused but didn't alert. Ethan studied the floor. Packed dirt, old hoof marks had hardened into shallow impressions. Nothing. He continued toward the rear. 3 narrow cuts appeared on a fence post just outside the western door. Ethan stopped. The marks were almost hidden beneath weathering. 1, 2, 3, parallel. Too even to be random damage. He ran his thumb across them. Old, very old, maybe meaningless, maybe not. He photographed them with his phone anyway. Old habits weren't always bad ones. By noon, Ethan forced himself away from the mystery. The farm still needed work. He found a usable ladder in the equipment shed and spent 2 hours repairing the porch roof. Then he pulled weeds away from the farmhouse foundation and inspected the well. The pump remained a problem. The truck remained another. His money had dropped below $100 after food, fuel, and hardware. A sensible man, Ethan thought, would concentrate on surviving the rehabilitation agreement. A sensible man would not spend his afternoon investigating scratches on a dead farmer's fence post because his dog disliked a patch of dirt. At 3:30, Ethan found himself inside the barn again. Don't say anything. Atlas walked past him. Ethan inspected the old workbench. Most of its surface was covered by rusted bolts, horseshoe nails, a broken level, and a coffee can full of screws. Underneath, however, the wood carried another set of marks, not words, lines, several short scratches intersecting at deliberate angles. Ethan brushed away dust. One line ran toward the back wall, another crossed it, a third ended beneath a knot in the timber. He stood. Samuel, what were you doing? Wind moved through the gaps in the siding. No answer. Ethan stepped outside and looked from the workbench toward the 3 notches on the fence post, then toward the place Atlas had marked. The 3 points didn't align exactly, but they were close enough to make him uneasy. On the 3rd day, Atlas alerted again. On the 4th, he did it twice. Ethan began marking each location with small stones. Atlas wasn't identifying a broad area. His nose kept returning to the same narrow strip beside the foundation. Ethan resisted the temptation to dig. Not yet. There were too many possible explanations, and his experience had taught him that assumptions became dangerous when you started treating them as facts. So he widened the search. He photographed the barn, measured distances, checked the foundation, examined the inside walls board by board. Late that afternoon, sunlight came through the western doors at a low angle and revealed something he'd missed. 4 boards behind an old feed cabinet were a slightly different shade from the rest. Ethan narrowed his eyes. He dragged the cabinet away from the wall. Atlas immediately stood. Dust rose around them. The boards were old enough to match the barn, but their nails weren't. Not exactly. Several nail heads showed faint circular scars where a hammer or claw had once pulled them free. Someone had removed those boards, then replaced them. Atlas approached. His nose moved along the lowest board. He stopped. Ethan felt a chill despite the warmth inside the barn. Again? Atlas looked up. Ethan fetched a pry bar. The first nail protested. The second came easier. Ethan worked slowly because the wood was dry and brittle. One board came free, nothing behind it except darkness between studs. He removed another. Atlas leaned forward. Ethan shone his flashlight into the cavity. At first he saw cobwebs, then something pale. He reached carefully between the studs. His fingers touched cloth. Waxed cloth. He pulled out a flat, rectangular bundle roughly the size of a paperback book. For several seconds, he simply held it. The wrapping had hardened with age but remained mostly intact. He carried it to the workbench. Atlas stood beside him. Well, Ethan gently unfolded the material. Inside was a photograph, black and white. 4 men stood behind this very barn on what looked like a late summer afternoon. Ethan recognized Samuel Grady from a framed photograph he'd noticed in the farmhouse. Grady had been younger then, perhaps 50, broad through the shoulders, wearing suspenders and a battered hat. Beside him stood an older man Ethan didn't know. Another was tall and narrow-faced. The fourth wore a clean button-down shirt and held a rolled survey map beneath one arm. Ethan stared at that face. He had seen it recently, silver hair now, more weight around the jaw, but the eyes were the same. Richard Caldwell. Ethan turned the photograph toward the light. No. He looked again. There was no mistake. The county administrator who had told Ethan Samuel Grady was simply a deceased property owner with no successful heirs, had stood beside Grady's barn years earlier, not in passing, not somewhere in Pine Hollow, here, on the farm, holding what appeared to be survey documents. Ethan felt the first real thread of suspicion tighten inside him. He remembered Caldwell's office, the calm explanation, the rehabilitation agreement, the brass key sliding across the desk. He remembered asking what was wrong with the property. Caldwell had mentioned taxes, auctions, repairs. Not this. Ethan sat on the edge of the workbench. Atlas rested beside his knee. Maybe there's an explanation. Said it aloud because he wanted to hear whether it sounded convincing. It didn't. He flipped the photograph over. There was handwriting on the back. Faded pencil. Ethan carried it toward the barn door, where the afternoon light was stronger. The letters had been written slowly, pressed deep enough into the paper that he could feel their grooves beneath his thumb. There was no date, no names, only one sentence. Ethan read it once, then again. The mountains beyond the barn had begun turning blue with evening. Wind moved through the dry grass. Atlas stood perfectly still beside him. Ethan looked toward the patch of earth where the dog had first alerted, then toward the 3 cuts on the fence post, then back to Samuel Grady's words, "If they move the line again, the ground will remember." Ethan felt something shift inside him. Until that moment, he had been investigating because Atlas had found something strange. Now he understood something else. Samuel Grady had expected somebody to look. Maybe not Ethan. Maybe not 7 years later, but somebody, and whatever Grady had been afraid would disappear from paper, he had trusted the land to keep. Ethan slid the photograph carefully back into its waxed wrapping. Behind him, Atlas suddenly turned his head toward the hard patch beside the barn. The dog's ears lifted. Ethan followed his gaze. The earth remained silent, but it no longer looked empty. For the next 2 days, Ethan left it alone. That required more discipline than digging would have. He wrapped Samuel Grady's photograph in clean cloth and stored it inside the farmhouse beneath his copy of the rehabilitation agreement. Then he returned to the ordinary work of making 96 neglected acres survivable. The contrast was almost absurd. Somewhere on the property might be evidence of a secret Grady had carried to his grave. Meanwhile, Ethan still needed a functioning toilet. He repaired a leaking pipe beneath the kitchen sink, patched another window, cleared fallen branches from the driveway, and found that the old well produced water with a bitter mineral taste that he wasn't willing to trust. Atlas followed him everywhere. Every trip past the barn brought the same reaction: a glance, a pause, sometimes a slow pull of the nose toward the earth. But Ethan didn't give the command. Not yet. Atlas seemed to understand. Late Thursday afternoon, Ethan was inside the barn removing rusted wire from beneath a collapsed section of shelving when he heard Atlas yelp. The sound hit him harder than a shout. He turned instantly. Atlas had jerked his right front paw off the ground. Ethan crossed the aisle and dropped to one knee. A piece of old fencing wire protruded from beneath rotten hay. One broken end had caught the pad of Atlas's paw. Easy. Atlas tried to pull away. Ethan put a hand against his chest. Stay. The old command changed everything. Atlas became still. Ethan carefully freed the paw. The cut wasn't catastrophic, but it was deep enough that blood darkened the fur. Ethan's jaw tightened. He should have cleared the floor better. He should have seen it. That familiar voice arrived immediately. You missed something. Somebody got hurt because you missed something. Ethan closed his eyes for half a second. Not there, not then, here, Barn, Montana, Atlas. He wrapped the paw with clean gauze from the truck. We're going to town, Atlas licked his wrist. Don't start forgiving me. I'm still mad. The truck surprised them both by starting after Ethan struck the battery terminal with a wrench. 20 minutes later, they pulled into Pine Hollow. A painted wooden sign near the north end of town read, Foster Veterinary Clinic. The building was small, white, and surrounded by cottonwoods. Ethan carried Atlas through the door despite the dog's obvious opinion that he remained perfectly capable of walking. A woman emerged from the back room while pulling on examination gloves. She was around 40, with brown hair tied loosely behind her head and the calm movements of someone accustomed to frightened animals. I'm Dr. Megan Foster, Ethan Walker. This is Atlas. Megan looked at the dog. Let me guess. Atlas thinks this visit is unnecessary. For once, we agree. She smiled, sauntered. Ethan lifted him. Megan removed the temporary bandage and examined the paw. Atlas watched every movement. He's remarkably steady. He's had training. What kind? Ethan hesitated. Military working dog. Megan looked up. And you, same employer. She understood without asking for details. That alone made Ethan like her a little. Megan cleaned the wound, while Ethan kept one hand on Atlas's shoulder. When the antiseptic touched the deepest part of the cut, Atlas flinched. Ethan immediately leaned closer. Easy, partner. Atlas's eyes found his. Megan noticed. Not the command, the relationship. You two have been together a while. 9 years. A long deployment. Ethan looked at Atlas, longer than either of us expected. Megan finished wrapping the paw. No running for a few days. Keep the bandage dry. Come back if he starts favoring it badly. Ethan reached for his wallet. How much? 20. He looked at her. That's not the normal price. I don't need charity. I didn't offer charity. Megan removed her gloves. You can repair the loose board on my back gate next time you're in town. I was quoted $70 for it. I'm clearly getting the better deal. Ethan studied her face. No pity, no performance, just terms. He placed $20 on the counter. I'll fix the gate too, Megan smiled. Now I'm definitely getting the better deal. Outside, Ethan lowered Atlas carefully from the truck. You're expensive, a voice behind him said. That's Grady's dog? Ethan turned. An elderly man stood near the clinic fence. No. The man came closer. He was thin but still straight-backed, wearing worn jeans, a denim shirt, and a pale cowboy hat. Sorry, meant Grady's place. Ethan's attention sharpened. You knew Samuel Grady? The old man studied him. George Callahan, he offered a hand. Ethan shook it. I ran cattle 2 miles down the creek for 43 years. Knew Sam longer than I knew most people worth knowing. Megan stepped onto the porch. George knows every story in this valley. Half of them are even true, George said. Ethan reached into his jacket. He didn't show them the photograph, not yet. Instead, he asked, "Why did people stop wanting Grady's farm?" George's expression changed. "Depends who you ask. I'm asking you." The old rancher looked toward the mountains. Sam started telling people county maps were wrong. Megan leaned against the porch post. "That's the polite version." George nodded. He claimed boundary markers were being moved, said water rights didn't match the old surveys, spent years writing letters to county offices. Did anyone investigate? Some and records said Sam was wrong. George's mouth tightened. After a while, people stopped saying Samuel Grady had a dispute, started saying Samuel Grady had lost his mind. Ethan thought of the photograph hidden beneath his agreement. Richard Caldwell standing beside Grady, survey map beneath his arm. "What did you think?" George was quiet. "I thought Sam was stubborn." "That's not what I asked." The old man's eyes met Ethan's. "No, it isn't." A breeze stirred the cottonwoods. Finally, George said, "I saw one marker myself when I was young. Granite post above the irrigation cut. Years later, it wasn't where I remembered." "How far? Enough. Did you tell anyone?" "Sam and he said paper could be replaced. Signatures could disappear." George looked toward Atlas. "But stone remembers where men put it?" Ethan felt the words settle heavily. They were too close to Grady's message to dismiss. Megan noticed his expression. "You found something." Ethan looked at her. He gave nothing away, but George was watching him too. "Whatever you found," the old man said, "don't assume the loudest man in town is the dangerous one." Before Ethan could ask what that meant, an engine sounded from the street. A black ranch truck slowed beside the clinic. Travis Mercer sat behind the wheel. His eyes moved from George to Ethan, then to Atlas's bandaged paw. Mercer drove on. No greeting. That evening, Ethan returned to the farm with more questions than answers. He fed Atlas, changed his bandage, then sat at Samuel Grady's kitchen table with the photograph beneath the lantern. Caldwell looked perhaps 30 in the picture. Grady stood beside him, on the back. "If they move the line again, the ground will remember." Ethan was still studying it when Atlas raised his head. A vehicle approached. Headlights swept across the farmhouse wall. Ethan stood. A truck stopped outside. Travis Mercer stepped onto the porch. He carried no visible weapon. No smile either. Ethan opened the door, but remained inside the threshold. Little late for neighborly visits. "This isn't neighborly." Mercer looked past him toward the interior. "You settling in?" "Trying. I'll save us both some time." Mercer removed an envelope from his coat and placed it on the porch railing. $40,000. Ethan stared at him. "For what?" "You withdraw from the rehabilitation agreement. I cover the penalties. You leave Grady's place." Ethan almost thought he'd misunderstood. "You told me this land wasn't worth having." "It isn't." "Then why 40,000? Mercer's jaw moved slightly. "Because I can afford it." "That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting." Ethan looked toward the barn, Mercer noticed. That was enough. Something changed behind the rancher's eyes. Ethan stepped onto the porch. "Did you know Samuel Grady?" Mercer didn't answer. "Did you know Richard Caldwell knew him?" Still nothing. 40,000, Mercer repeated. "You could get a decent truck, rent somewhere, start over, start over." Ethan had heard those words before, usually from people who meant disappear somewhere else. He looked through the doorway. Atlas stood inside on 3 good legs, watching them. Ethan thought about the diner, the brass key, the first repaired window, the night Atlas had pulled him back from a place thousands of miles away. He thought about how quickly $40,000 could disappear, and how long it had been since he'd possessed anything that couldn't be packed into a truck. "No," Mercer exhaled. "Think about it. I just did." "Walker, no." For several seconds, the 2 men stood beneath the porch light while moths circled above them. Then Mercer's gaze shifted past Ethan, toward Atlas. The German shepherd was staring back. Mercer's expression hardened, but beneath the hardness, Ethan saw something unexpected. Fear, not of Atlas, of what Atlas might find. Mercer stepped down from the porch. At his truck, he stopped. He looked once toward the dark barn, then back at Ethan. Then don't let that dog keep digging. Mercer climbed into his truck and drove away. Ethan stood motionless until the red taillights disappeared beyond the gate. Behind him came the soft sound of claws on old floorboards. Atlas moved beside him. Ethan rested a hand against the dog's neck. Across the pasture, the barn stood black beneath the stars. $40,000 for land supposedly worth nothing. Ethan looked down at Atlas, then toward the patch of earth behind the barn. "All right, partner," his voice was quiet. "Tomorrow we find out why." Morning came cold and clear. A thin layer of frost silvered the grass in the lowest parts of the pasture, and the Bitterroot Mountains stood sharp against a pale blue sky. Ethan was awake before sunrise, though he could not honestly say he had slept. $40,000! The number kept returning, not because he regretted refusing it, because Travis Mercer had offered it too quickly. Men didn't pay $40,000 to escape worthless land, and they didn't warn you about a dog unless they believed the dog was getting close to something. Ethan brewed coffee on Samuel Grady's old stove and spread a sheet of brown packing paper across the kitchen table. Atlas lay nearby, his bandaged paw extended in front of him. "You're on limited duty." Atlas lifted his head. "Doctor's orders," the dog stared. "Don't look at me like that. I outrank you." Atlas lowered his head again. Ethan almost smiled. Then he began drawing the barn, the fence post, the 3 cuts, the workbench scratches, the wall where the photograph had been hidden. Finally, he marked every place Atlas had alerted. When he finished, Ethan leaned back. There was a pattern, not perfect, but close. The dog's strongest alerts clustered behind the barn near the foundation, within several feet of the hard patch Ethan had first examined. Ethan looked toward the window. Sunlight had begun touching the barn roof. "All right," he folded their paper. "Let's work." He didn't immediately take a shovel. Instead, Ethan spent nearly an hour inspecting the ground again. He pushed a thin steel rod into several locations, checking resistance. He studied drainage and examined the foundation stones. He looked for utility lines or old pipes. Nothing suggested an obvious hazard. Only then did he bring the shovel. Atlas followed, despite his injured paw. Observation post. Ethan pointed toward a folded blanket beneath the barn overhang. Atlas reluctantly settled there. Ethan placed the shovel at the edge of the disturbed patch. For a moment he thought about Samuel Grady, a man dead 7 years, a man dismissed as paranoid, a man who had hidden a photograph inside his own barn and written a warning on the back. If they moved the line again, the ground will remember. Ethan pushed the shovel into the earth. The first 6 inches were stubborn. Roots, stones, packed clay. Below that, the soil changed. Looser, darker. Ethan stopped. Someone had dug here before. He widened the hole carefully. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Sweat ran between his shoulder blades despite the cold morning. Atlas watched every movement. The shovel went down again. Clang, Ethan froze. Atlas stood. "Stay!" The dog remained where he was. Ethan knelt and cleared soil with his gloved hands. A curved metal surface emerged. Not pipe, not machinery. He uncovered more. The object was roughly 2 feet long and cylindrical, heavily corroded, wrapped in the remains of what had once been waterproof canvas. Ethan sat back on his heels. "So you were right." Atlas's tail struck the blanket once. Ethan widened the hole enough to lift the cylinder free. It was heavier than expected. He carried it into the barn and placed it on the workbench. For several seconds, he simply looked at it. Treasure crossed his mind. Of course it did. $40,000 from Mercer, a hidden photograph, a buried container. He imagined gold coins for perhaps 3 seconds, then experience corrected him. People usually buried things because they feared losing them. That didn't mean the things had monetary value. Ethan worked the corroded latch loose. The lid resisted. He used a screwdriver, metal scraped, then the seal broke with a soft hiss. Inside were several packages wrapped separately in oilcloth. No gold, no cash, no jewelry. Ethan felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment. Guess we're still broke. Atlas came closer. Ethan unwrapped the first bundle, 3 old brass survey markers. Each was stamped with numbers. The second contained several rolls of undeveloped photographic film sealed inside small metal canisters. The third was a notebook. Black cover, water-stained edges. On the first page, Samuel Grady, Property Observations. Ethan turned carefully through it. Dates, measurements, rainfall, creek levels, fence positions, distances between stone markers. Some entries went back more than 20 years. He opened the 4th package. Maps, not one, several, hand-drawn lines crossed printed county survey sheets. Certain boundaries had been circled. Numbers had been corrected in pencil. Arrows pointed toward springs, ridgelines, irrigation cuts, and old roads. Ethan carried everything into the farmhouse. He placed the documents beneath the kitchen window, where the light was better. Atlas settled beside his chair. For the next hour, Ethan compared coordinates. At first, they meant almost nothing. Then he found Samuel Grady's property description in his rehabilitation agreement. Ethan copied those coordinates onto a separate page, compared them. Only some of Grady's handwritten points were on the 96 acres. Others extended north, east, west into the foothills. One appeared to lie near George Callahan's old ranch, another near Mercer's property. Several followed the creek. 3 clustered around a mountain spring nearly 5 miles away, and one sequence traced what looked like an abandoned irrigation corridor across the valley. Ethan leaned closer. This isn't just about the farm. Atlas opened his eyes. Ethan spread the maps across the table. Grady hadn't been documenting one boundary. He had been documenting a network.land.water survey markers, properties belonging to different families, the same kinds of things George said Grady had spent his final years arguing about. Ethan opened the notebook again. A name appeared on several pages. Caldwell, sometimes followed by an initial, sometimes nothing else. Another name appeared repeatedly, Mercer. Ethan's suspicion sharpened. But the dates were old. Some entries had been written when Travis Mercer would have been a much younger man, and some before Richard Caldwell held his current county position. Ethan reminded himself of the rule he'd lived by for years. Information wasn't evidence until context made it evidence. He continued. Near the bottom of the cylinder remained one final package. An envelope. The paper was yellowed but protected by waxed cloth. Across the front, Grady had written, "For whoever finds the first marker." Ethan stared at the words. First marker. Not final. First. He opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a single handwritten page. The writing was the same as the message behind the photograph. Slow, heavy, certain. Ethan read, "If you found this, they failed to erase everything." He stopped. Outside, wind moved through the cottonwoods. Atlas lifted his head. Ethan continued. The markers were removed in stages. Some records were changed afterward. I kept what I could where paper alone could not betray it. Below that were several numbers, coordinates, and beneath them, one final sentence. Don't trust the newest map. Ethan lowered the letter. A truck passed somewhere on the distant county road. He waited until the sound disappeared. The farmhouse seemed different now. So did the farm. Yesterday, it had been 96 acres nobody wanted. Today, Ethan wasn't certain that had ever been true. He returned to the county maps. One version from Grady's container was dated 28 years earlier. Another was 17 years old. Ethan retrieved the current property map Caldwell had provided. He placed all three side by side. At first, the differences were subtle. A creek line shifted slightly, a boundary angle changed, a service road disappeared. Then Ethan noticed the water corridor. On the oldest map, a narrow right-of-way ran from the mountain spring through Grady's land and continued toward several lower ranches. On the newest map, part of that corridor no longer existed, not physically, on paper. Ethan touched the missing section. He remembered George. Paper could be replaced. Signatures could disappear. Stone remembers where men put it. Atlas rose suddenly. He walked toward the front door, stopped, listening. Ethan immediately gathered the maps. No vehicle approached. No footsteps. After several seconds, Atlas relaxed. Probably deer, maybe nothing. But Ethan realized he was holding his breath. He looked at the room around him. He had spent years trying to escape the part of himself that turned every unknown sound into a possible threat. Now somebody else's mystery was inviting that man back. Ethan closed his eyes. He would not do this that way. No obsession, no assumptions, no turning the farm into another battlefield. Facts, only facts. He placed Grady's materials inside that wooden box from behind the truck seat. For the first time in years, Ethan removed his metals to make room for something else. He stared at them in his palm. Small pieces of metal from another life, then he wrapped them carefully and placed them in the kitchen drawer. Grady's evidence went into the box. Atlas watched. Tomorrow we talk to George. Ethan locked the box, and maybe Megan knows somewhere we can develop old film. Atlas rested his muzzle on Ethan's knee. Ethan scratched behind his ear. Mercer thought you were going to dig up something valuable. He looked at the hidden container sitting empty beside the stove. He was right, just not in the way either of them had expected. Night fell early beneath the mountains. Ethan checked the doors once, only once. Then he changed Atlas's bandage, ate dinner, and turned down the lantern. Near midnight, something touched his arm. Ethan woke instantly. Atlas stood beside the sleeping bag. No barking, no whining. The dog's ears pointed toward the barn. Ethan sat up. Atlas looked at him, then toward the window. The old working posture had returned. Ethan heard it a moment later. A faint metallic sound. From outside, not wind. The night was almost completely still. Then came another sound. Wood moving against wood. Ethan rose silently and crossed to the window. Moonlight lay across the pasture. The barn stood black at the far edge of it. For several seconds, nothing moved. Then a narrow beam of light appeared between two boards. It vanished. Reappeared. Someone was inside the barn. Ethan looked down. Atlas was already waiting beside him. For a few seconds, neither moved. The farmhouse was dark, except for a thin stripe of moonlight across the floor. Outside, the barn stood nearly 100 yards away, its weathered shape pressed against the black wall of the mountains. Another flicker of light moved behind the boards. Someone was definitely inside. Ethan felt the change happen in his body, heart rate rising, hearing sharpening. Every doorway, window, fence line, and patch of shadow suddenly acquired importance. It was a sensation he knew too well. Useful once, dangerous now. He crouched beside Atlas. Quiet, the German shepherd's mouth closed. Ethan pointed toward the back of the farmhouse. They did not go straight to the barn. That was the first decision. Whoever had entered the property might expect someone awakened by noise to come through the front door and cross the open pasture. Ethan had spent too many years learning what happened to people who chose the obvious route. He slipped on his boots and jacket, then quietly opened the rear kitchen door. Cold mountain air entered. Atlas moved first. Ethan followed him into the tree line behind the house. They circled west through tall grass and scattered pine, keeping the barn between themselves and the pale moon. Ethan's eyes adjusted quickly. Atlas moved with astonishing silence for a dog his size. 9 years old, bandaged paw, still working. Ethan touched his shoulder once. Easy. Atlas slowed. From behind the barn came a muted scrape, then a dull knock. Whoever was inside wasn't simply sheltering there. They were searching. Ethan moved closer until he could see through a gap in the western wall. A flashlight beam swept across the interior. Workbench, feed cabinet, floor. Then the light stopped over the place where Ethan had removed the boards. The photograph. The intruder knew where to look. Ethan's stomach tightened. A shadow crossed the opening. Adult, probably male, dark jacket, cap, nothing else clear enough to trust. Ethan considered calling out. Instead, he waited. He wanted to know where the person went. The flashlight disappeared. A second later, the rear barn door shifted. Atlas stiffened. Ethan whispered, "Stay." The intruder emerged and immediately moved toward the forest rather than the road. That answered another question. This wasn't somebody wandering through. Ethan stepped from behind the pine. Stop. The figure froze. For one heartbeat, the valley became completely still. Then the intruder ran. Atlas surged forward. Atlas, heel. Every instinct in the dog seemed to argue with the command. But he obeyed. Ethan ran after the figure while keeping Atlas close. The ground fell away toward an old service road hidden beneath weeds and young pine. Branches struck Ethan's shoulders. Ahead, an engine turned over. Headlights flashed between the trees. Ethan reached the road just as a dark vehicle accelerated away. He saw only fragments, pickup or large SUV, mud across the tailgate. One rear light dimmer than the other. No readable plate. Atlas pulled toward the tire tracks. Easy. The dog lowered his nose. He followed the scent 20 yards before stopping beside a broken branch where the intruder must have brushed through the trees. Atlas inhaled deeply. Ethan watched. Got him? Atlas looked toward the road. Maybe. Scent memory could last, but scent wasn't a name, and Ethan refused to turn guesses into certainty. He stood listening until the engine disappeared. Then they returned to the barn. The damage was precise. The feed cabinet had been moved. The boards Ethan removed were scattered across the floor. The old hole behind the barn had been searched. So had the workbench, but Grady's rusted tools remained untouched. Nothing appeared stolen, because what mattered was already inside Ethan's farmhouse. The container, notebook, maps, film, letter. The realization chilled him more than the night air. The intruder hadn't come to steal valuables. He had come looking for information. Ethan checked the ground near the doorway. Boot impressions, common tread, partial only. He photographed them. Then he found a streak of wet clay beneath the rear door. The soil around the barn was dry. The service road, however, dipped through a shaded drainage cut where the earth remained damp. Ethan photographed that too. Facts. Only facts. By sunrise, though, facts were no longer enough to quiet his nervous system. He drove nails into 2 loose doors, strung small metal washers on cord across the equipment shed entrance, moved furniture away from farmhouse windows, checked the tree line, then checked it again. He carried Grady's evidence from one hiding place to another. Kitchen floorboard. No. Too obvious. Bedroom wall. No fire risk. Truck. Absolutely not. He finally placed the wooden box beneath a loose section of flooring in the pantry. Then he stood there staring at it. Atlas watched from the doorway. It's temporary. Atlas said nothing. Ethan covered the floorboard. He checked the front window. Nothing. An hour later, he checked it again. By afternoon, exhaustion had sharpened every sound. A truck on the county road made him stop hammering. A hawk landing on the barn roof turned his head. A branch scraping the upstairs window sent him halfway across the room before he realized what it was. He knew what was happening. That was the worst part. He could identify hypervigilance clinically. He could describe the cycle: threat, scanning, sleep loss, increased sensitivity, more scanning. Knowing the name did not automatically give him control over it. At dusk, Atlas brought his food bowl to Ethan. Ethan looked at the clock. He had forgotten to feed him. Guilt struck immediately. Sorry. Atlas set the bowl down. Ethan poured his dinner. The dog didn't eat. Instead, he looked at Ethan. I'm fine. Atlas remained still. Ethan rubbed both hands over his face. Don't. The dog approached. I said I'm fine. Atlas pressed against his knee. Ethan stood too quickly. The chair scraped backward. Atlas flinched. Ethan froze. The shame was instant. He had never frightened Atlas intentionally. Never. Hey! He crouched. Atlas came to him without hesitation. Ethan put both hands around the dog's neck. That wasn't you. Atlas leaned forward. I know. Ethan sat on the kitchen floor. For a while, they remained there together. That night, Ethan didn't sleep. He sat near the living room window with coffee gone cold beside him. At 1:13, he checked the barn. At 1:41, the driveway. At 2:06, the back door. At 2:38, he heard gravel. He stood. Nothing. At 3:17, he realized he'd been staring at the same tree for almost 20 minutes because one branch resembled a human shoulder. He closed the curtain. The farmhouse no longer felt like a home. It had become a position. Doors became entry points. Windows became vulnerabilities. The pasture became exposed ground. The forest became concealment. And somewhere beneath all of it, Ethan recognized the bitter truth. The intruder had left hours ago, but Ethan had let him stay. At 4:02, a sound came from the porch. Ethan turned sharply. His body moved toward the door. Atlas stepped into his path. Move, Atlas didn't. Ethan tried stepping around him. The German shepherd shifted with him. Atlas, the dog, pressed against Ethan's legs. Move! Atlas refused. Then Ethan noticed his own hand. It was shaking. Not much, enough. His breathing had become shallow. The room seemed too narrow, the door too close. Something was coming. Something was always coming. Atlas rose onto his hind legs and pushed his front paws against Ethan's chest. The weight forced Ethan backward. Atlas. The dog pushed again. Ethan's back touched the wall. Atlas dropped and leaned his entire body against him. Pressure, contact, present. Ethan shut his eyes. A memory flashed. A doorway overseas, dust, a voice over a radio, a decision that still visited him in sleep. He opened his eyes. Farmhouse, Montana, Atlas. Here. Atlas remained against him. I'm here. Ethan slid down the wall until he sat on the floor. His head dropped into his hands. For 3 years, he had told himself that leaving was practical. Leave the job before somebody saw him struggle. Leave the apartment before the bills swallowed him. Leave the shelter before crowded rooms became unbearable. Leave towns before anyone learned enough to ask questions. Movement felt like control. But sitting on Samuel Grady's floor before dawn, Ethan wondered how many times fear had simply renamed itself as strategy. Atlas rested beside him. Outside, the eastern horizon slowly turned gray. Ethan looked toward the barn. He imagined another night, another vehicle, another week without sleep. He imagined spending 12 months watching tree lines and listening for footsteps. No. The word came quietly. He stood. By sunrise, everything Ethan owned was back in the truck. Clothes, tools, sleeping bag, food. Grady's evidence hidden beneath the seat. The medals remained wrapped in the kitchen drawer for several minutes before Ethan went back and retrieved them too. That hurt more than he expected. The farmhouse already looked abandoned again, as if the place had simply inhaled him for a few days and was now breathing him back out. Ethan opened the passenger door. Load up. Atlas stood in the yard. Come on. The dog looked at him. Ethan pointed. Atlas. Load. It was a command the German shepherd had obeyed thousands of times. Atlas walked toward that truck, stopped, then turned away. Alice. The dog continued across the pasture. Ethan stared in disbelief. Atlas, the German shepherd, moved toward the barn. His limp was almost gone now, though the white bandage remained around his paw. He passed through the long morning shadow of the building. Then he reached the patch of ground where the cylindrical container had been buried. Atlas circled once, lay down, and rested his head between his paws. Ethan stood beside the truck. Seriously? Atlas didn't move. Ethan crossed the pasture. We're leaving. The dog looked up. Ethan pointed toward the truck. Load. Nothing. Ethan felt frustration rising. Then he looked at Atlas more carefully. There was no confusion in the dog's face, no fear, no disobedient excitement, only stillness. For almost 3 years, Atlas had climbed into that truck whenever Ethan said the word. Seattle, Spokane, Boise, Missoula, motels, parking lots, shelters, construction sites, road after road. The dog had never once asked where they were going. He had simply gone wherever Ethan went. Now, for the first time, Atlas was choosing not to. Ethan looked toward the farmhouse. The repaired window caught the morning sun. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney. Beyond it, the Bitterroot Mountains stood bright beneath a cloudless sky. He looked down at Atlas. The dog placed his head back on the earth. Ethan slowly sat beside him. Cold soaked through his jeans. For a long time he said nothing. Then he rested one hand against Atlas's back. You think this is home? Atlas breathed quietly beneath his palm. Ethan looked at the truck packed for another departure, then at the barn, then toward the place beneath them where Samuel Grady had trusted the ground to remember. For the first time, Ethan wondered whether staying could require more courage than leaving. The morning warmed slowly around them. Ethan sat beside Atlas until sunlight cleared the eastern ridge and spread across the pasture. Somewhere near the creek, a meadowlark called. The sound was so ordinary it almost hurt. Atlas remained stretched across the disturbed earth. "You've followed me everywhere," Ethan said. The dog's ear moved. 3 years of bad motels, parking lots, jobs I couldn't keep. Ethan rubbed a hand over the gray beginning to show around Atlas's muzzle. Never complained once. Atlas turned his head. Ethan looked toward the pickup. Everything was packed. Again. That was what finally embarrassed him. Not homelessness, not the old truck, not even the fear that had kept him awake. It was how practiced he had become at disappearing. He knew how to fit a life behind a truck seat in 15 minutes. He knew which parking lots tolerated overnight vehicles. He knew how to leave before anyone could ask whether he needed help. He had spent years calling it independence. Maybe sometimes it was. Sometimes it was simply fear with better manners. Ethan exhaled. All right, Atlas lifted his head. We stay. The dog stood immediately. Ethan stared at him. You could have done that 10 minutes ago? Atlas shook himself, then started toward the farmhouse. For the first time that morning, Ethan laughed. It wasn't much, but it carried across the empty pasture. He unpacked the truck slowly, sleeping bag first, then food, tools, clothes, Grady's evidence. Last came the wooden box containing his medals. Ethan stood in the kitchen holding it. He could have returned it to the truck. Instead, he placed it on the highest shelf beside Samuel Grady's old enamel cup. 2 lives. 2 histories. Neither needed to be buried today. Ethan made coffee. Atlas ate breakfast. Then Ethan removed the improvised alarms from the doors. Not all his precautions, just the ones built from panic rather than reason. He kept the locks, kept his phone charged, kept photographs of the tire tracks and boot impressions. But he took down the hanging washers and moved the chair away from the front window. Staying, he understood, did not mean becoming careless. It meant refusing to let fear make every decision. By noon, Ethan knew his next decision. He needed Travis Mercer, not because he trusted him, because Mercer had offered $40,000 and warned him about Atlas. Those facts required an explanation. Ethan changed Atlas's bandage, put Grady's photograph and copied coordinates into his jacket, then started the truck. "You're coming." Atlas jumped in without hesitation. Ethan gave him a look. Of course, Mercer's ranch lay north of the Grady property, beyond a long stretch of rolling pasture. Compared with Ethan's place, it looked almost impossibly prosperous. Straight fences, painted barns, heavy equipment parked beneath open sheds. Black cattle moved across green fields fed by irrigation lines. At the center stood a broad cedar house facing the mountains. Ethan stopped beside the main barn. Mercer emerged before he could knock. The rancher looked from Ethan to Atlas. "So you changed your mind?" "No." Mercer's face hardened. "Then why are you here?" Ethan removed the photograph. He held it out. Mercer didn't take it at first. Then he saw Samuel Grady and Richard Caldwell. The change was immediate. Color seemed to leave his face. "Where'd you get that?" "Grady's barn." Mercer took the photograph. He studied the four men. His thumb stopped over one face Ethan hadn't identified. "Who is he?" Mercer looked up. "My father." Ethan's suspicion sharpened. "Then let's stop pretending you don't know what this is about." Mercer handed the photograph back. "You should leave. You tried that already. I'm not buying the farm anymore." "Good. I'm telling you to leave my property." Ethan didn't move. Atlas sat beside him. Caldwell knew Grady. Mercer said nothing. Grady buried survey markers, maps, coordinates that landed. Mercer's eyes moved involuntarily toward the equipment sheds. Ethan noticed. "I found the first cache." Mercer stepped closer. "First," that's what Grady called it. Lance stretched between them. Then Mercer looked toward the ranch house, as though checking whether someone was watching. "Come with me." He led Ethan past the main barn to an older equipment shed near the far fence. The building looked unused. Inside were a dismantled hay rake, stacked fence posts, oil drums, and an old wooden desk beneath a canvas tarp. Mercer closed the door. Atlas remained beside Ethan. Mercer pulled the tarp away. He unlocked the desk. Inside were letters. Dozens, some in envelopes, others bundled with twine. Mercer selected one. My father was Robert Mercer. He handed it to Ethan. The letter was dated 31 years earlier. Samuel Grady's name appeared at the bottom. Ethan read slowly. The letter referred to a disputed survey, a spring-fed irrigation right, and acreage transferred after a boundary correction. "You said Grady's farm ruined people." "It did. That wasn't the whole truth." No, Mercer looked older inside the dim shed. "My father lost the 112 acres after the county said an earlier survey was defective. More important, we lost access to water feeding the eastern pasture." Ethan glanced toward the green fields outside. "Looks like you recovered." "Eventually. I bought water rights elsewhere. Cost my family 20 years. Grady helped him. Grady tried." Mercer opened another bundle. He measured everything himself. Fence corners, stone monuments, creek bends, old irrigation cuts. He believed several county revisions weren't mistakes. Were they? I don't know. You offered me $40,000 without knowing. Mercer's jaw tightened. I knew enough. He pulled another letter free. My father died believing somebody had taken land from him with paperwork. Samuel kept digging. Then other ranchers started finding differences in their records. Why didn't anyone go to authorities? They did. Mercer gave a bitter laugh. The authorities brought out the newest maps and told everyone the newest maps were correct. Ethan remembered Grady's message. Don't trust the newest map. Where does Caldwell fit? Mercer stared at the floor. Richard's father, Leonard Caldwell, worked with a private survey company before Richard entered county government. And Richard, young assistant back then. Records, field surveys, whatever his father needed. Ethan pictured the photograph, holding the rolled map. You think the Caldwells changed boundaries? I think Samuel believed it. That's not what I asked. Mercer looked at him. I think my father lost land he should never have lost. Outside, wind pushed it against the metal siding. Ethan folded his arms. Why warn me about Atlas? Mercer took several seconds to answer. Because I saw where he was digging. You were watching us? I drove past, saw the disturbed soil, then offered 40,000. I thought Samuel might have left something. You've been searching. For years. The words changed the room. Ethan stared at him. Mercer continued. After Samuel died, I tried to buy Grady's farm at the first auction. My bid was rejected over a filing issue. Second auction never completed. After that, the county kept the property tied up, so you wanted me gone so you could search it. At first, Mercer looked toward Atlas. Then I realized if you found something, whoever buried this history might realize it too. Ethan thought of the night visitor. You know someone came onto my property? Mercer's head snapped toward him. When? Last night. What did they take? Nothing. Seemed relieved for half a second. Then he understood. They were looking. Exactly. Ethan stepped closer. Was it you? No. Can you prove that? I was here. Alone? Mercer's expression told Ethan the answer wasn't useful. Ethan watched him. Every instinct wanted a clean classification. Threat, ally, enemy, safe. But life outside the teams had taught him that people rarely fit into boxes that neatly. Mercer had lied. Mercer had tried to buy him out. Mercer had been searching Grady's property for years, and yet the letters in Ethan's hands told a story that made his behavior possible, without making it innocent. A false assumption could be just as dangerous as no information at all. Ethan handed the letter back. Show me everything. For the next 2 hours, they worked through the bundles. Robert Mercer had corresponded with Samuel Grady for nearly 11 years. Some letters concerned cattle and equipment. Others became increasingly specific: coordinates, survey references, names of neighboring families, disputed water channels. One letter mentioned George Callahan. Another referred to a granite benchmark above an irrigation cut. Then Ethan found an envelope marked in Grady's handwriting. Travis, keep this if your father won't. Mercer stared at it. I've read that 100 times. Ethan unfolded the page. Most of it described a survey performed after spring flooding. Near the bottom, one sentence had been underlined twice. Ethan read it aloud. Caldwell knows exactly where the original benchmark is. Neither man spoke. Atlas stood, his ears lifted toward the shed door. Ethan immediately stopped reading. A vehicle passed on the distant ranch road. They waited. The sound faded. Mercer exhaled. Richard Caldwell gave you that farm. Yes. Why? Rehabilitation program. Mercer shook his head slowly. No, I understand how. He looked directly at Ethan. I'm asking why. That question followed Ethan all the way back to the Grady farm. By evening, the mountains had disappeared behind gathering clouds. Ethan stood beside the barn with Atlas. He looked toward the hole where the first container had been buried. Caldwell had given him the key. Caldwell had known Grady. Caldwell's family was connected to the old surveys, and someone had searched the barn immediately after Ethan found Grady's evidence. Still, none of it proved Caldwell had done anything wrong. Not yet. Ethan crouched beside Atlas. We don't chase people. The dog watched him. We follow evidence. Atlas's nose lifted into the mountain wind. Ethan unfolded Grady's coordinates. One point lay near the old irrigation cut George had mentioned. Another sat deeper toward the forest edge. And beside those numbers, Samuel Grady had drawn a small square. Ethan studied it. The same shapes appeared on one of Mercer's letters. Beneath it were 2 handwritten words. Original benchmark. Atlas rose. For the first time since Ethan had decided to stay, he felt no urge to pack. Only the steady pull of a question that had survived longer than the man who first asked it. Somewhere beneath the valley, Samuel Grady had left the next piece, and now Ethan knew where to begin looking. By 7 the next morning, 4 men and 1 old German shepherd stood around the Grady farmhouse table. George Callahan had brought coffee in a dented steel thermos. Travis Mercer brought a leather tube containing old ranch maps. Ethan brought Grady's notebook, the coordinates from the buried cylinder, and every suspicion he had learned not to confuse with proof. Atlas brought the one thing none of them possessed, a nose that didn't care what county records said. George adjusted his glasses over Grady's oldest map. That's the old irrigation cut. His finger traced a faded blue line running from the mountain foothills, through the Grady property, then north and east across land now divided among several ranches. Mercer laid a modern county map beside it. The difference was immediate. On the newer map, the corridor stopped at the Grady boundary. "Water doesn't stop at property lines," Ethan said. "No," George replied. "But paperwork can make it look like it does." Ethan turned several pages in Grady's notebook. Original benchmark. Granite above irrigation cut. 43 paces west of Split Pine. George's expression tightened. "I know that place." Mercer looked at him. "You said the marker disappeared. The one I remembered did." George tapped the notebook. "But Samuel isn't describing the marker. He's describing where it was measured from." Ethan understood. A survey monument could be removed. Terrain was harder to move. By 8:30, they were walking toward the forest edge. Atlas's paw had healed enough for Megan to approve short, controlled exercise, though Ethan kept him close. The abandoned irrigation trench appeared beyond a stand of cottonwoods. At first it looked like nothing more than a shallow depression filled with grass and young pine. Then Ethan noticed how unnaturally straight it was. Human-made, long forgotten. George stopped beside a rotting stump. There used to be water running knee-deep here every spring. Mercer stared down the trench. "My father said the same thing." They followed it uphill. After several hundred yards, Atlas pulled toward a cluster of stones. "Easy," Ethan loosened the leash. Atlas lowered his nose. He moved along the trench, stopped, doubled back, then sat beside what appeared to be an ordinary patch of earth. Ethan crouched. "Show me." Atlas touched his nose to the ground. Ethan scraped away leaves. Concrete appeared. Mercer knelt opposite him. "Foundation, looks like it." They cleared more. A square concrete base emerged, perhaps 18 inches across. At its center was a circular depression. Empty. George removed his hat. "Brass marker." "Removed," Ethan said. "Deliberately," Mercer replied. Ethan photographed everything before anyone touched more soil. 20 yards farther uphill, they found another, same concrete, same empty socket, then a third, 3 survey foundations, 3 missing markers. George stood between them, staring down toward the valley. Samuel wasn't crazy. Nobody answered. There was nothing useful to say. They continued toward the Split Pine. It took nearly an hour. The original tree had fallen years ago, but the enormous gray trunk remained on the hillside, split down the center by lightning or age. George counted 43 paces west. "Nothing," Mercer counted. "Nothing." Ethan studied the slope. "Grady was shorter than you." George looked offended. "Everybody was shorter than Travis." Ethan almost smiled. Then Atlas pulled toward the trees, not hard, purposefully. Ethan followed. Atlas stopped beside a moss-covered stone. Ethan cleared it. Granite, the top surface had been cut flat, but whatever had once been attached there was gone. Mercer swore quietly. George crouched and ran his fingers across the stone. "That's it? You sure? I watched Samuel set a transit above this ridge when I was 23 years old." George's voice softened. "I thought I remembered wrong." Ethan photographed the stone. Then he looked through the trees. From that position, the entire valley opened beneath them. Grady's farm sat almost directly below. Mercer's ranch stretched north. Beyond it lay other fields, roads, and scattered houses, and running through all of them was water, creeks, ditches, ponds, green strips of pasture. Ethan looked at Grady's coordinates. This isn't about acres. Mercer followed his gaze. It's about access. George nodded. In this country, land without water can become worthless fast. They spent the afternoon reconstructing Grady's route. Each coordinate led to something physical. A stone wall, an old fence corner, a buried concrete base, a dry diversion gate almost swallowed by willow roots. Someone had removed markers, but they hadn't removed the landscape. Near 4 o'clock, Atlas began pulling toward higher ground. Ethan checked the notebook. No coordinate up there, Atlas continued. Mercer looked at Ethan. You trust him? With my life, they followed. The forest thickened. Pine needles softened their footsteps, and the valley disappeared behind dark trunks. Atlas moved slowly, nose working. He led them toward a collapsed stone retaining wall built into the mountainside. George frowned. Never seen that. Ethan examined the stones. Most were covered with moss. One section wasn't. Here, several stones had fallen outward, exposing a narrow cavity behind them. Mercer reached forward. Ethan stopped him. Photographs first. Mercer withdrew his hand. Ethan documented the wall. Then they carefully removed 2 loose stones. Behind them sat a wooden ammunition box coated in black pitch. George whispered, Samuel. They carried it into the open. The lid opened with difficulty. Inside were documents wrapped in oilcloth, more maps, old photographs, water agreements, survey sheets, letters, receipts. Ethan felt the same surge he had experienced opening the cylinder behind the barn. But this time there was no thought of treasure, only evidence. They spread several papers across Mercer's coat. One photograph showed a county survey crew beside a brass monument. Another showed the same location years later. The monument was gone. A handwritten water agreement carried signatures from 5 ranch families, including Mercer's father and George's older brother. George stared at the signature. Tom, his voice almost disappeared. He died believing he'd signed away those rights. Mercer turned toward him. Maybe he didn't. George removed his glasses and wiped them even though they weren't dirty. For a moment, Ethan saw what this mystery really contained. Not maps, not land. Years, families who had blamed fathers, neighbors who had blamed neighbors. People who had sold farms because somebody told them the ground beneath their boots belonged to someone else. Ethan returned to the documents. One sheet listed payments to a surveying contractor. Bitterroot Land and Resource Services. The name seemed familiar. Ethan searched his memory. Then he remembered the rehabilitation paperwork Caldwell had given him. A company with almost the same name appeared as consultant on a proposed county land consolidation plan. He pulled out his phone and photographed the document. Mercer leaned closer. What? I've seen this company. George pointed toward a signature near the bottom, Leonard Caldwell. Mercer went still, Richard's father. Ethan continued down the page. Several later payment records had been clipped behind it. Dates moved forward, names changed, companies reorganized, then one document stopped Ethan completely, a beneficiary authorization, recent, not 30 years old, not 20. 7 years, the year Samuel Grady died. Ethan read the name twice, Richard Caldwell. Mercer stepped back. George lowered himself onto a fallen log. Lord, Ethan's pulse accelerated. He forced himself to slow down. One document did not prove an entire conspiracy. One payment did not explain motive. But the pattern was no longer historical. It had reached the present. Atlas suddenly lifted his head. Ethan saw the change instantly, quiet. Everyone stopped. Atlas stared downhill. Far below, an engine sounded. A vehicle moved along the Forest Service road. They couldn't see it through the trees. Mercer whispered, "Nobody uses that road." The engine slowed, then stopped. Ethan began gathering documents. Pack everything. George looked at him. You think somebody followed us? I think we don't wait to find out. They resealed the ammunition box and divided the documents among 3 packs. Ethan kept the photographs and payment records. Mercer carried the maps. George took the water agreements. If one person lost his load, the evidence would survive somewhere else. They descended by a different route. Atlas moved beside Ethan. The engine never restarted. That bothered Ethan more. By sunset, they were back at the Grady farmhouse. George left first. Mercer remained on the porch. What now? We make copies. And Caldwell, we don't confront him. Mercer frowned. We have his name. We have paper with his name. That's different. You still think this could be innocent? I think believing what I want is how mistakes get made. Ethan looked toward Atlas. Grady spent years telling people the truth. Nobody believed him because he couldn't prove enough of it in a way they couldn't dismiss. He turned back to Mercer. We don't repeat that, Mercer nodded reluctantly. After he left, Ethan called Megan. I need a favor. Atlas okay? He's fine. That was her first question, Ethan noticed. I need access to a scanner. I have one at the clinic. I can't bring this into town. Silence. Megan asked, What did you find? Enough that I don't want there to be only one copy. Another pause. I can bring the portable scanner tomorrow. Don't tell anyone. Ethan, please. His tone made her stop. All right. Next, Ethan searched through the regional contacts George had given him. One name appeared beside a note. Rebecca Lawson, property attorney, Missoula, he called. Voicemail. Ethan left only his name and asked her to return the call regarding historical survey documents connected to disputed water rights. Then he sat at Grady's table. Atlas lay beneath it. The documents covered almost every available surface. Ethan studied the oldest map again. Lines spread through the valley like veins. At their center sat Samuel Grady's supposedly worthless farm, not because it contained gold, because it occupied the narrow ground between the mountain water source and thousands of acres below. Ethan touched the line crossing the property. He finally understood why boundaries mattered so much. Move one line far enough on paper, and eventually fences moved, water moved, money moved, families moved, and somebody benefited. Outside, darkness settled across the valley. Ethan walked to the porch. Atlas joined him. Far below, Pine Hollow's lights appeared one by one. For the first time, Ethan didn't see a town that had reluctantly allowed him to stay. He saw families living on ground whose history might have been rewritten beneath them. His phone rang, unknown number. Ethan answered. Ethan Walker? A woman's voice. Yes, this is Rebecca Lawson. You left a message about historical water rights. Ethan looked toward the papers inside. How quickly can you get to Pine Hollow? There was a pause. That depends. On what? On whether you have the property dispute or evidence of a crime. Ethan looked down at Atlas, then toward the dark outline of the barn. I think Samuel Grady spent 30 years trying to prove they're the same thing. Rebecca Lawson was silent for a moment. Then her voice changed. No surprise, no excitement, professional caution. Do not confront anyone named in those records. I wasn't planning to. Do not give the originals to county personnel. Do not write on them, clean them, separate attachments, or reorganize anything, because it seems more logical. Ethan looked through the farmhouse window at the papers spread across Samuel Grady's old table. Understood. Photograph everything exactly where you found it. Make copies. Keep a written record of who has handled what. Already started. Another pause. You military? Former Navy? I thought so. Why? Because most people call an attorney after they've confronted the person they're accusing. Ethan almost smiled. When can you come? Tomorrow afternoon. Possibly evening. Until then, preserve what you have. Rebecca hesitated. And Mr. Walker? Yes. If those records affect multiple properties and water rights, this stopped being about your farm the moment you opened that box. The call ended. Ethan remained on the porch. Atlas sat beside him. The wind moved down from the mountains, carrying the smell of pine and cold earth. She noticed that too. Atlas looked up. Inside, Ethan divided the evidence. Originals went into the wooden box. Photographs remained backed up on his phone. Several important documents were copied by hand into a notebook, including dates, company names, and the payment connected to Richard Caldwell. He texted Megan. "Tomorrow. Bring scanner if you still can. Come before dark." Her answer arrived almost immediately. "I can close early, around 5. Then another message. "And Atlas better not be overworking that paw." Ethan looked down. Atlas's bandaged foot rested innocently on the porch. "You're being monitored." The German shepherd yawned. Ethan slept better that night. Not well, but better. He woke twice instead of 6 times. Both times Atlas was beside the bed. Both times Ethan recognized the room before his body could convince him he was somewhere else. Morning arrived beneath a low ceiling of clouds. By noon, the temperature had dropped. George came by with an old metal document case and stayed long enough to help Ethan identify 3 families named in Grady's water agreements. Mercer called once. Ethan told him only that an attorney was coming. "Rebecca Lawson? You know her?" "By reputation. Good or bad. Depends which side of the table you're sitting on." That was good enough. Shortly after 3, Ethan's phone rang again. The number displayed County Administration. He stared at it. Atlas raised his head. Ethan answered. "Walker." A woman's voice spoke quickly. She identified herself as an assistant from the county office. There had been a report of livestock through the southern fence near Ethan's property line. Several cattle might have entered the old service corridor. Ethan looked toward the pasture. "I don't own cattle. They may belong to neighboring property." "Mr. Caldwell asked whether you'd check before they reached the county road," Caldwell asked. "Yes, sir." Ethan said nothing. The woman continued. "The report came from a driver about 15 minutes ago. It sounded ordinary. That was what bothered him. Still, loose cattle on a mountain road could cause a serious accident." Ethan pulled on his jacket. "Which fence?" "Far southwest corner. Near the wooden bridge. I'll check." He ended the call. Atlas stood immediately. "No." Atlas followed him to the door. "Stay." The dog pushed past his leg. Ethan stopped. Atlas's ears were forward. "What's wrong?" The German shepherd looked toward the barn, then back at Ethan. Ethan opened the door. Atlas stepped outside and immediately turned away from the southwest pasture, toward the barn. "Atlas." The dog returned, grabbed Ethan's jacket sleeve gently, and pulled. That behavior was unusual, very unusual. Ethan looked toward the southwest fence. Nothing moved. No cattle, no dust, no distant bawling. He checked the time. Megan would be coming up the valley soon. Atlas pulled again. Ethan's instincts tightened. Not the old uncontrolled alarm, something quieter. Pattern recognition, the call, Caldwell's name, a remote fence line, evidence inside the farmhouse, Megan arriving with equipment to copy it. "Okay." Ethan turned back. "We stay." Atlas released his sleeve. Then Ethan smelled smoke. Faint, almost hidden beneath wood smoke drifting from distant homes. Atlas spun toward the barn. Ethan followed his gaze. For 1 second, nothing appeared wrong. Then orange light flashed behind the weathered boards. Fire. They ran. Flames had already caught along the barn's rear wall. Too fast, far too fast for an accidental spark in a building with no electricity. Ethan reached the nearest rain barrel, threw off the lid, and stopped. The fire was climbing into the dry rafters. A bucket wouldn't matter. "Atlas, back!" The dog remained near him. Ethan grabbed his phone and called emergency services. He gave the address, barn fire, possible structure exposure. Then he called Megan. No answer, again. Nothing. The flames reached the roof. A section of old timber cracked. Ethan backed away. The evidence, most of it was inside the farmhouse, but the ammunition box from the retaining wall, still containing several originals, had been temporarily stored in the barn beneath the workbench after George helped sort them. Ethan saw the window above the workbench glowing orange. He took one step forward. Atlas barked sharply. Then the sound came. Not from the barn, from below the farm. A crash, metal wood splintering. Then a horn began sounding continuously. Ethan turned towards the valley road. Through the trees near the narrow wooden bridge, something had struck the railing. His phone rang. Megan. Ethan answered while running. Megan? Static, then coughing. Ethan, where are you? The bridge. His stomach dropped. What happened? A truck. The connection broke. Ethan sprinted. Atlas ran beside him. They crossed the lower pasture as smoke rolled behind them. The old wooden bridge spanned a narrow ravine where spring runoff cut through the property. Megan's SUV sat diagonally across it. The front end had smashed through part of the railing. One rear wheel hung over open space. Steam rose from the hood. A fallen branch and broken bridge timbers blocked the driver's side. Megan. No answer. Ethan approached carefully. Megan? A hand appeared weakly behind the cracked window, alive. He reached the passenger side. The door was crushed against the railing. Megan was conscious, but dazed. Blood marked her temple. The portable scanner case lay upside down behind her seat. Ethan, I'm here. What happened? I don't know. Her eyes struggled to focus. Someone came around the curve. What kind of vehicle? Dark truck. Ethan stopped. The night visitor. Maybe not. Facts, only facts. Behind him, flames from the barn rose higher. Wind pushed sparks across the pasture. The farmhouse stood between the bridge and the burning structure. If the fire spread through the dry grass, Grady's documents inside could be lost. Ethan looked back. Years of evidence, names, maps, water agreements, the proof Samuel Grady had protected for decades. Then Megan groaned. The choice lasted less than a second. Paper could burn. A person could not be replaced. Atlas, here! Ethan climbed onto the damaged bridge. One support beam had shifted beneath the SUV. He could hear wood complaining under the vehicle's weight. He tried the rear door. Jammed. Front door. Jammed. Megan, can you move your legs? My left one. And the right. Silence. Megan, stuck. Ethan looked beneath the dashboard. Twisted metal had trapped her lower leg. He couldn't reach the angle from outside. Atlas pushed toward a narrow opening near the broken railing. No. The dog stared at Megan, then at Ethan. Smoke drifted down the slope. Ethan understood. Find Atlas squeezed through. His shoulders barely cleared the gap. Megan turned her head. Atlas? The dog reached her. He pressed his muzzle against her hand. She closed her fingers around his fur. I'm okay, she whispered. Ethan wasn't sure whether she was telling him, Atlas, or herself. He climbed onto the hood. The windshield was fractured but intact. He used a rescue hammer from Megan's roadside kit to clear a safe opening at the edge, protecting her face with his jacket. The smoke thickened. Behind them, the barn roof collapsed with a roar. Sparks lifted into the darkening sky. Ethan did not turn around. He widened the opening. Stay with me, Megan. I'm here. Atlas moved deeper beside her trapped leg. Ethan could hear the dog scratching. Atlas, show me. The German shepherd nosed toward the lower dashboard. Ethan followed the angle. A bent support bracket had pinned Megan's boot, not her leg. The metal had trapped the boot against the floor. Good boy. Ethan reached through. He couldn't move the bracket, but he could reach the laces. Megan, I'm taking your boot off. Do it. He cut the laces, pulled. Nothing, again. She twisted her ankle. Ethan pulled harder. The boot came free. Megan cried out, but her leg moved. That's it. He began lifting her toward the windshield opening. Then Atlas barked. One sharp warning. Ethan looked up. A burning section of timber had fallen from the bridge approach, where wind-blown debris had ignited dry brush. Flames spread across the broken railing. Smoke swallowed the road behind them. Megan, arms around my neck, she obeyed. Ethan pulled. Her shoulders cleared, then her waist. A loud crack sounded beneath the SUV. The vehicle shifted. Atlas was still inside. Atlas, the dog turned. Out! Atlas scrambled toward the gap. Another burning timber dropped across the route. Ethan saw it falling. Atlas moved first. The German Shepherd lunged through the narrow opening and slammed against Ethan's legs. Ethan stumbled backward with Megan in his arms. The timber crashed exactly where he'd been standing. Atlas disappeared beneath smoke. Ethan lowered Megan onto the road beyond the bridge. Then he turned back. A dark shape emerged. Atlas stumbled from the smoke. He took 3 steps, then collapsed. Ethan reached him. Hey! Hey, buddy! Atlas tried to rise, couldn't. His right shoulder was bleeding through singed fur. Ethan dropped to his knees. For one terrible second, the valley disappeared. No fire, no maps, no Caldwell, only Atlas, the dog who had followed him through war, through divorce, through parking lots, through nights Ethan hadn't believed he could survive. Stay with me. Atlas's eyes found his. Ethan pressed his forehead against the dog's head. I'm here. Sirens sounded in the distance. Megan called weakly from behind him, Ethan. He looked back. She was sitting upright, alive. He looked toward the farm. The barn was engulfed. Part of the roof was gone. The evidence stored there was almost certainly lost. Someone had tried to pull him away. Someone had set a fire. Someone had forced Megan off the road. Every trained instinct in Ethan screamed to search the road. Find tracks. Find the vehicle. Find whoever had done this before they disappeared. Instead, he slipped both arms beneath Atlas. The dog weighed nearly 80 pounds. Ethan lifted him. Atlas made a small sound against his chest. I know. Ethan carried him away from the fire. He did not look toward the road. He did not chase shadows. He did not choose the enemy. This time, he chose the living being in his arms. By dawn, the Grady barn was a black skeleton against the mountains. Fire crews had saved the farmhouse. Megan had been taken to the clinic, treated, and released with bruising, stitches, and a badly sprained ankle. Atlas lay on blankets in Ethan's front room after emergency treatment from Megan and another veterinarian who had driven in from Missoula. The shoulder wound was painful. His side was badly bruised, but nothing vital had been damaged. Alive. That word was enough. Ethan sat on the floor beside him. He had not slept. Outside, tires rolled across the wet driveway. A county vehicle stopped near the porch. Richard Caldwell stepped out. He carried 2 cups of coffee. His expression was grave. Ethan rose slowly. Caldwell removed his hat as he approached. I heard what happened. Ethan said nothing. Terrible thing. Caldwell looked toward the ruins. After everything you've done here. He climbed the porch steps. I thought you might need... A low sound came from inside. Caldwell stopped. Ethan turned. Atlas had lifted his head from the blankets. His body was weak, his shoulder bandaged, his breathing slow, but his eyes were fixed through the open doorway, not on Caldwell, on Caldwell's truck. The growl came again, deeper this time. Ethan looked from Atlas to the vehicle. Mud coated the truck's lower panels, thick reddish clay, the same color as the drainage cut beside the abandoned Forest Service road, the road used by the night visitor. Ethan's face revealed nothing, but something inside him became very still. Caldwell extended one of the coffees. Ethan didn't take it. Behind him, Atlas kept growling. Richard Caldwell lowered the coffee slightly. For the briefest moment, something changed in his face. Not fear, recognition. Then the practiced concern returned. Poor animals had a terrible night. Ethan kept his eyes on Caldwell. He has, Caldwell glanced toward the burned barn. Fire Marshal, have any idea what started it? Not yet. And Dr. Foster, alive, I'm glad. Ethan watched him closely. Caldwell's boots were clean enough. The truck wasn't. Reddish clay had dried beneath the wheel wells and along the rocker panels. Ethan had photographed clay exactly that color after the intruder fled down the abandoned service road. It meant something. It did not yet mean enough. Years ago, Ethan would have pressed, asked one question too many, watched the eyes, forced the mistake. But this wasn't a battlefield, and suspicion wasn't evidence, so he stepped aside. Long night. Atlas needs quiet. Of course. Caldwell placed both coffees on the porch railing. If there's anything the county can do, I'll call. Caldwell hesitated. Then he put on his hat and walked back toward his truck. Atlas's growl followed him. Ethan stood in the doorway until the vehicle disappeared down the road. Only then did he reach for his phone. Rebecca answered on the second ring. Tell me you didn't confront him. I didn't. Who? Caldwell. Silence. Ethan described the truck, the clay, Atlas's reaction. The call that had drawn him toward the far fence before the fire. Megan's account of the dark vehicle forcing her toward the bridge. Rebecca listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, Good. Now don't touch his truck. Don't follow him. And don't turn your dog into courtroom proof. I know Atlas's behavior matters to you because you know him. Investigators need physical evidence. Ethan looked at the wounded shepherd. Then let's give them some. Rebecca arrived before noon. She was a compact woman with silver beginning at her temples, a dark field coat, and the expression of someone who preferred documents to speeches. A state investigator came with her. Then another. Ethan walked them through everything from the beginning, the rehabilitation agreement, the photograph, the buried cylinder, the maps, the night visitor, the service road tracks, Mercer's letters, the retaining wall cache, the fire, the phone call, Megan's crash. He showed them photographs with dates and times. Rebecca examined the materials that had survived in the farmhouse. Most of the documents from the first buried container were safe, but several originals from the mountain cache had been lost in the barn. The investigator looked toward the blackened ruins. Could still recover fragments. Maybe, Ethan said, but he knew fire. Some things didn't come back. By afternoon, the farm had become quiet again. Investigators left to examine the bridge, road, fire site, and county call records. Rebecca took copies, not originals. George arrived with food Ethan didn't remember asking for. Mercer stayed away, which Ethan appreciated. Megan called from home. Her voice was tired. How is he? Ethan looked at Atlas. Sleeping. Good. How are you? A pause. I asked about the dog first, didn't I? You did. I'm bruised, angry, embarrassed that my SUV lost an argument with a bridge. Not your fault. Did you sleep? No, Ethan. I'm fine. That's not what I asked. He looked out the window. No. Then sleep. He almost told her he couldn't. Instead, he said, I'll try. That evening, Ethan lay on the floor beside Atlas. He didn't chase Caldwell, didn't study maps, didn't search the ruins. For once, the mystery could wait. Atlas could not. Every few hours, Ethan checked his breathing. Every time the dog shifted, Ethan woke. Near midnight, Atlas opened his eyes and nudged Ethan's hand. Ethan rested his palm against the dog's neck. You've done enough. Atlas closed his eyes. More than enough. For 3 days, nothing happened. And those 3 days became some of the hardest Ethan had spent on the farm. Action had always been easier than waiting. Waiting left room for memory. The smell of smoke remained in the walls. Whenever Ethan closed his eyes, he saw the timber falling toward the bridge, then Atlas disappearing beneath it. He would wake with his hand searching the floor. Atlas was always there. On the fourth morning, Megan drove out in a borrowed truck. She moved carefully because of her ankle, but she refused Ethan's attempt to take the medical bag. "I still have one good leg and two unreasonable arms." Atlas heard her voice and tried to stand. "Don't you dare," Megan said. His tail struck the blanket. She knelt beside him. The shoulder was healing. Bruising remained along his ribs. No running, no climbing, no heroic nonsense. Ethan leaned against the wall. "Tell him again. I was talking to both of you." For the first time since the fire, the farmhouse felt almost warm, not because of the stove, because someone else was inside it, without bringing danger. Megan stayed for coffee. Before leaving, she touched the burned edge of the porch railing. "Are you staying?" Ethan looked toward the barn ruins. "Yes." She nodded. No praise, no pity, just acceptance. "Good." A week after the fire, Atlas walked outside without assistance. Slowly, Ethan kept him on a short lead. The morning was bright and cold. Frost clung to the blackened timbers where the barn had stood. Atlas stopped, his nose lifted. "Easy!" Dog turned toward the ruins. Ethan tried redirecting him. "Not today." Atlas resisted. Not hard, just enough. Then he lowered his nose. Ethan felt something shift. This wasn't curiosity. He had seen this behavior before. "Atlas." The dog pulled toward the burned foundation. Ethan followed carefully. Most of the barn floor was covered in ash, collapsed roofing, and charred beams that investigators had already marked and examined. Atlas ignored the area where the first cylinder had been found. He moved along the eastern foundation, stopped, sniffed, moved again, then turned toward the rear stone footing. One section had survived almost untouched because it sat below ground level beneath a heavy granite block. Atlas began scratching. "Hey!" Ethan stopped him immediately. His injured shoulder didn't need the strain, but Atlas stared at the stone. Ethan crouched. "What is it?" Atlas touched his nose to a narrow gap beneath the blackened footing. Ethan smelled ash, wet earth, stone. Nothing else. He did not dig. Rebecca's words returned. "Don't touch anything else." Ethan photographed the location and called her. Within 2 hours, Rebecca returned with the same state investigator. They documented the footing. Then, under supervision, the granite block was lifted. Beneath it was a narrow rectangular cavity lined with stone. Inside sat a metal box, smaller than the first container, far better protected. Nobody spoke. The investigator photographed it before removing it. The box had a corroded latch, but no lock. Inside were wax-sealed packets. Rebecca put on gloves. The first packet contained signed original survey documents, not copies, originals, dates, witness signatures, county stamps. The second contained photographs. Samuel Grady stood beside brass survey monuments. Some showed George as a young man. One showed Robert Mercer. Another showed Leonard Caldwell beside surveying equipment. And in the background, barely 20 years old, stood Richard Caldwell. The third packet contained an old microcassette recorder wrapped in cloth. A tape remained inside. George arrived before they played it. Mercer came 10 minutes later. Megan returned too. They gathered inside the farmhouse while the investigator connected the recording through an adapter. Static filled the room. Then a man's voice emerged. Old, rough. "Samuel Grady. My name is Samuel Grady. This statement concerns the original valley benchmarks and the water corridor running south from Bitterroot Spring." George lowered his head. Grady continued. He described dates, survey changes, removed markers, meetings, warnings. He named Leonard Caldwell. Then he mentioned Richard, not as the architect of the original changes, as someone who knew where records had gone. Some who had personally visited Grady after Grady began challenging the newest county maps. The recording crackled. Then Grady said something that silenced the room. "The farm isn't the prize, it's the reference." Rebecca looked sharply toward the documents. The recording continued. "The original benchmark beneath the east barn footing establishes the line from which the lower surveys were measured. Take away the marker, change the map, and a man can argue anything. But the stone and the original measurement together tell where the line began." The investigator turned toward Ethan. "Benchmark?" They returned outside. The metal box had occupied only half the cavity. Beneath it was another fitted stone. Once documented and carefully cleared, a brass disc appeared embedded in granite. Its surface was dark with age, but the stamped numbers remained visible. George made a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob. "That's it." Mercer removed his hat. Rebecca crouched beside the marker. Then she looked across the valley. "Do you understand what this means?" Ethan did. The farm wasn't merely land involved in the dispute. It contained the physical reference point, the starting position against which historic property boundaries and water access could be compared. Samuel Grady hadn't hidden treasure beneath his barn. He had protected a fact. And facts, Ethan knew, could become more valuable than gold when enough people had spent years trying to bury them. Back inside, Rebecca compared the benchmark number with Grady's original survey sheets. They matched. Then, with the modern county records, a coordinate had shifted, small on paper, enormous across miles of land. The investigator leaned back. This could reopen every affected survey tied to this reference. Mercer stared toward the window. "My father." George looked at him. He wasn't imagining it. Mercer closed his eyes. For the first time since Ethan had met him, the wealthy rancher looked less like an angry man than a son who had waited decades to hear that his father had not been a fool. Ethan felt Atlas lean against his leg. He looked down. The dog was tired, but his eyes were clear. Rebecca continued sorting documents. Then she stopped at Ethan's rehabilitation agreement. She placed it beside a recent county consolidation proposal recovered from Grady's materials. Her expression changed. "Ethan." "What?" "When Caldwell offered you this property, how many previous applicants did he mention?" "Only that nobody completed the year." Rebecca turned another page. "Look at this." The consolidation proposal showed several parcels surrounding the Grady farm. If the farm returned to county control after failed rehabilitation, it could eventually be incorporated into a larger tract connected to downstream water access. Mercer leaned over the table. "He wasn't helping you." Ethan said nothing. The humiliation of that first day returned. The old truck, $143, a homeless veteran with nowhere permanent to go. Caldwell had looked at Ethan and seen the perfect candidate, someone desperate enough to sign, isolated enough not to ask questions, damaged enough that leaving after a few months would surprise no one. Rebecca's voice softened. "He expected you to fail." Ethan looked through the doorway toward the burned barn. "No," Atlas rested it against him. Ethan put his hand on the dog's graying neck. "He expected us to leave." That was Caldwell's mistake. He had chosen a man famous only to himself for disappearing. He had counted on fear, on isolation, on another abandoned farmhouse becoming another temporary stop. But he had failed to account for the one creature who had followed Ethan through every departure, the one creature who, when the truck was packed again, had simply refused to climb inside. Rebecca closed the file. "Don't touch anything else." Ethan looked at the brass benchmark outside, surrounded now by evidence markers and cameras. "What Atlas found is enough?" Rebecca shook her head. "Not by itself." Then she looked at Grady's originals, the photographs, the financial records, the recording, the benchmark. "But together?" She allowed herself the smallest smile. "Together, Samuel Grady may finally get heard." Ethan looked down at Atlas. The dog had already lowered himself carefully beside Ethan's chair. His injured shoulder rested against Ethan's boot. For years, people had believed the Grady farm was worthless. Caldwell had believed Ethan was temporary. And Ethan had believed staying was something other people knew how to do. All three assumptions had been wrong. Outside, sunlight broke through the clouds and fell across the blackened barn foundation. At the center of the ruin, surrounded by ash, the old brass benchmark caught the light. After decades beneath the ground, the valley finally had its starting point again. By noon, the Grady farm no longer belonged only to Ethan's quiet corner of Montana. Two state investigators walked the burned foundation with cameras and evidence bags. A licensed surveyor arrived from Missoula. Rebecca Lawson worked at Samuel Grady's kitchen table with 3 legal pads, a laptop, and a growing stack of copies. Nobody touched the benchmark without documentation. Nobody moved an original without recording it. Ethan appreciated that. For weeks, everything had depended on memory, instinct, and a dog's nose. Now the truth was entering a world where every inch needed a number. Atlas slept near the stove. His injured shoulder still forced him to lie carefully, but whenever someone crossed the room, one ear lifted. Megan had left strict instructions: no running, no climbing, no working. Atlas appeared to disagree with all three. Ethan sat beside him and rested a hand against his ribs. Retirement. Atlas opened one eye. That's an order. The eye closed. Outside, the surveyor established equipment over the original brass disc. A second technician carried measurements toward the surviving granite points Ethan, George, Mercer, and Atlas had found along the abandoned irrigation corridor. By late afternoon, Rebecca stepped onto the porch. She held 2 maps. "Come see this." Ethan joined her. She placed the older survey over the modern county map. The original benchmark fixes this position. Her finger touched the Grady farm. From here, the historical surveys established the old corridor north and east. Then she shifted to the modern map. This reference point moved. How far on the record? It looks small. She looked across the valley. On the ground, it changes acreage, access, and water rights across multiple properties. Ethan stared toward the mountains. A line on paper. That was all it took. Move it slightly, then let distance multiply the lie. Rebecca continued. One bad survey can happen, 2 can happen, but when the same changes repeatedly benefit connected parties, and original markers disappear while replacement records appear, you start asking who benefited. Exactly. George Callahan arrived before sunset. He carried a cardboard box. Inside were old tax notices, letters, and a faded photograph of his brother Tom standing beside an irrigation gate that no longer officially existed. George placed the photograph beside Grady's map. That's the lower gate. Rebecca studied it. You know the year? 1991. Tom had just bought that hat. George smiled faintly. He thought it made him look like Robert Redford. Nobody laughed loudly, but the room softened. Then George's expression changed. 2 years later, county records said that gate wasn't ours. Rebecca looked at him. What happened? Tom borrowed money to drill a well. George stared at the photograph. Couldn't make the payments after 2 dry summers. Sold most of the place. He swallowed. Spent the rest of his life believing he'd made a bad deal. Mercer arrived shortly afterward with his father's letters. For once, he entered without anger. He placed the bundle beside George's box. My father blamed yours for signing away the water. George nodded. Mine blamed yours for fencing the upper channel. The 2 old disputes sat between them. Then Mercer gave a tired smile. Maybe they were both yelling at the wrong people. George looked toward the benchmark outside. Would be the first time neighbors got mad at each other while somebody else held the pencil. Ethan watched them. That, more than any map, revealed the scale of what had happened. Land had been taken, but something else had been taken with it. Trust. Families had spent decades believing other families were responsible. Samuel Grady had apparently understood that, and because he could not force people to believe him, He had made the ground itself his witness. The following morning, investigators obtained access to archived county records. Rebecca did not tell Ethan everything. She couldn't, but by afternoon she returned with an expression that told him enough. They found duplicate survey files, different numbers, different versions. She sat across from him. Several documents in the public file don't match archived working copies. Dates were changed. Reference numbers were altered. Some signatures require examination. Caldwell's name appears. Ethan remained still. His father's too? She hesitated. And the company from Grady's Records, Bitterroot Land and Resource. Rebecca nodded. It changed names twice. Eventually, its holdings were absorbed into another entity. She turned her laptop. A corporate record appeared. Ethan read the beneficiary, Richard Caldwell. He had already seen the name in Grady's documents. Seeing it independently confirmed was different. Rebecca closed the screen. Now we have records from separate sources pointing toward the same financial connection. Ethan looked toward Atlas. Enough? Enough for investigators to keep going. Not enough for revenge, not enough for dramatic certainty. Enough for the truth to acquire momentum. That mattered more. Later that afternoon, Megan arrived to examine Atlas. The dog stood carefully while she checked his shoulder. Better. Ethan looked hopeful. How much better? Better enough to continue being annoyed that you won't let him work. Atlas wagged his tail. Traitor, Ethan said. Megan smiled. Then she looked through the window toward the investigators. Is it really as big as everyone says? Ethan considered the question. I don't know how big it is. He looked at George and Mercer standing near the old irrigation cut. But people lost land. Megan's smile disappeared, and the fire still being investigated. She nodded. That answer was harder than accusation. Ethan could feel the old part of himself demanding certainty. Name the threat. Locate it. Instead, he waited. 2 days later, the waiting produced something. The state investigator returned with photographs taken from the abandoned service road. Tire impressions had survived in the shaded clay. They weren't perfect, but the tread pattern and wheel spacing were consistent with Caldwell's county truck. More importantly, security footage from a fuel station outside Pine Hollow showed the same truck traveling toward the forest road on the night Ethan surprised the barn intruder. Caldwell had claimed elsewhere that he had been home. Still circumstantial. Still not the whole story. Then came the county phone records. The call that sent Ethan toward the southwest fence before the fire had originated through the administration office. The assistant had genuinely believed there were loose cattle. The report given to her had come through Caldwell. No driver had ever reported livestock. Rebecca placed the written summary on Ethan's table. He created the reason for you to leave the farm. Ethan stared at it. And Megan? We don't know whether her crash was planned, opportunistic, or caused by someone else connected to this. Ethan's jaw tightened. Rebecca saw it. That distinction matters. I know. Good. She closed the folder, because this is where people destroy strong cases. They get one piece of proof and use it to fill every remaining blank. Ethan nodded. Facts. Only facts. He had said it so often that it had become almost another command. That evening, Ethan walked Atlas slowly along the pasture. The barn ruins were fenced off now. Autumn had begun touching the cottonwoods with yellow. The mountains were already collecting white along their highest ridges. Atlas stopped near the place where the first cylinder had been buried. Ethan waited. The dog sniffed once, then continued. The mystery no longer lived there. For the first time, Ethan realized he no longer needed it to. They reached the upper fence. From there, Pine Hollow appeared small beneath the mountains. Smoke rose from chimneys. Headlights moved along the valley road. Ordinary lives. Ethan wondered how many people down there knew their property lines, only because a piece of paper told them where to stop. He understood that kind of faith. Lives depended on things people never expected to question. Deeds, records, promises, orders. Then one day something shifted, and the ground beneath you stopped feeling certain. Atlas leaned against his leg. Ethan looked down. "Yeah," he scratched the dog's neck. "I know something about that." The next morning, Rebecca asked Ethan to meet her at the farmhouse table. George and Mercer were already there. A state investigator stood near the window. On the table lay Ethan's rehabilitation agreement. Beside it was the county consolidation proposal. Rebecca pointed to a paragraph Ethan had barely noticed when he signed. If the occupant failed to maintain continuous residence and basic rehabilitation for 12 months, the parcel returned automatically to county control. So, Rebecca slid over another document. These are the previous rehabilitation attempts. Ethan read the names. 4 applicants. None lasted a year. 1 stayed 5 months. Another 3. The shortest lasted 11 days. Why? Different reasons. Money, isolation, structural problems. Mercer leaned over the table. And after each failure, the county retained control. Rebecca placed another map down. A planned consolidation zone surrounded Grady's farm on 3 sides. The 96 acres sat like the missing piece of a puzzle. George whispered, "My God." Rebecca pointed toward the old water corridor. If this property returned permanently to county control and was later folded into the consolidation plan, the surviving benchmark and historic access corridor could become much harder for private landowners to challenge. Ethan remembered Caldwell behind his desk. Friendly voice, clean shirt, a free farm, an opportunity. He remembered how Caldwell had looked at Ethan's worn jacket and old truck. A homeless former SEAL, $143, no local family, no permanent address, no community, no reason, apparently, to remain anywhere. The truth arrived without drama. That made it colder. Caldwell chose me because he thought I'd fail. Rebecca didn't answer immediately. We can't prove what was in his mind when you signed. Ethan appreciated the precision, but the evidence supports investigating whether the rehabilitation program was used to keep this parcel cycling back into county control while the consolidation plan moved forward. Mercer leaned back. He didn't give Ethan the farm. George finished the thought. He gave him a year to quit. Ethan looked toward Atlas. The dog lay beside the stove. The morning he had packed the truck returned with perfect clarity. Door open, engine ready, everything he owned loaded again. Atlas walking away from the passenger seat, returning to the barn, lying on the ground, refusing to leave. Ethan felt something tighten in his throat. Caldwell had calculated almost everything correctly. Ethan had been exhausted, isolated, poor, afraid, ready to run. The calculation had failed because Caldwell had measured only the man. He had not measured the dog. Ethan stood and walked to Atlas. The German shepherd lifted his head. Ethan knelt. "You stubborn old son of a gun." Atlas licked his wrist. Behind him, George chuckled. Rebecca gathered the documents. "There is one more thing." Ethan turned. "The benchmark establishes more than your property line. Combined with the original surveys, it may affect several historic claims throughout this valley." Mercer's expression changed. "How many? We don't know yet. Could families recover land? Some disputes may be reopened. Others may involve compensation or restored access rather than property transfer. It will take time." George nodded slowly. Time's all Samuel ever asked anybody to give him. Rebecca looked toward the ruined barn. He gave everyone else something more useful. "What proof?" Outside, clouds moved away from the bitter roots. Sunlight crossed the valley in a broad, moving band. It reached Mercer's pasture, then George's old property, then the roofs of Pine Hollow. Finally, it crossed the Grady farm. Ethan stepped onto the porch. Atlas followed carefully. The dog stood beside him, shoulder still healing, muzzle gray in the morning light. Down by the ruins, investigators worked around the brass benchmark Samuel Grady had hidden beneath stone. The farm had never been worthless. Its value simply couldn't be counted in dollars. It was the place where the lie had started. And now it was the place where the truth could be measured. Ethan rested his hand against Atlas's neck. For the first time since arriving in Pine Hollow, he wasn't wondering who wanted him gone. He was thinking about what it might mean to remain after the danger passed. Behind them, Rebecca stepped onto this porch. Ethan. He turned. She held a sealed evidence copy in one hand. State investigators have enough to move forward. Ethan looked toward Pine Hollow. What happens now? The part nobody puts in exciting stories. Rebecca gave him a tired smile. Records, interviews, survey reviews, hearings, lawyers. Months of people arguing over dates and signatures. George came through the doorway behind her. Sounds terrible. It is. Mercer followed. Good. They laughed quietly. Even Ethan, Atlas's tail moved once against his leg. The laughter faded into the open valley, and for once the silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt earned. Because Samuel Grady had finally been heard. Caldwell's carefully preserved reputation had begun to crack. Families who had spent decades believing they had lost everything through bad luck were about to learn that some losses had another explanation. And Ethan Walker, the man selected precisely because everyone expected him to disappear, was still standing on the porch. Atlas leaned against him. Ethan looked down at his oldest partner. The dog had found something buried beside a barn, but the thing he uncovered was larger than a metal container, larger than 96 acres, larger even than the scheme spreading across the valley. Atlas had uncovered the one fact Richard Caldwell had never planned for. Ethan Walker had finally found a reason not to run. Justice did not arrive with sirens racing up the Grady Farm Road. It came slowly, in folders, survey reports, recorded interviews, bank records, county meeting minutes, and long hours spent beneath fluorescent lights by people comparing signatures made decades apart. Rebecca had warned Ethan that the truth moved differently through a courtroom than it did through a burning barn. She was right. Weeks passed. State investigators traced payments connected to Bitterroot Land and Resource Services through successor companies and property interests. Independent surveyors compared Samuel Grady's original measurements with physical landmarks that still existed across the valley. The brass benchmark beneath the barn became the fixed point. From there, old lines could be reconstructed. And once those lines returned to where they had originally been, certain things became difficult to explain as mistakes. Several altered boundaries had benefited connected interests. Water access had shifted, records had been replaced. Original documents had disappeared from ordinary county files. The investigation did not prove every rumor Samuel Grady had ever believed. It didn't need to. It proved enough. Richard Caldwell was placed on administrative leave while investigators examined his role in the later records, the consolidation plan, and the events surrounding Ethan's rehabilitation agreement. Evidence connected his office to the false livestock report used to draw Ethan away from the farm. Investigators continued examining the barn fire and Megan's crash separately, refusing to claim more than the evidence supported. Ethan respected that. For years, his mind had punished him with certainty about things he could no longer change. Maybe truth required something harder. Patience. Caldwell eventually faced the legal system, not as a movie villain dragged from his office before a cheering crowd, but as a county official confronted by records that no longer agreed with the story he had spent years maintaining. For Ethan, that was enough. He didn't attend every hearing. He didn't need to watch Caldwell lose. He needed to watch the valley recover. Old claims were reopened. Some families discovered they had grounds to challenge boundary changes. Others began proceedings involving water access or compensation. Not everyone got back what had been lost. Some things could not be returned, after 30 years, a childhood home, a father's reputation, years spent angry at the wrong neighbor. But Samuel Grady's evidence gave people something they had been denied, the right to know what had happened. George Callahan received a letter one cold November morning concerning his family's historic water claim. He drove directly to Ethan's farm. Ethan found him standing beside the rebuilt section of fence, holding the envelope. Good news? George stared toward the mountains. They confirmed Tom's agreement was valid. He swallowed. My brother didn't sign that water away. Ethan waited. George's eyes shone. He died thinking he ruined us. There was nothing Ethan could say that would repair that, so he stood beside him. After a while, George folded the letter carefully. I'm going to put this by his picture. Then he looked at Ethan. Should have believed Samuel. You believe him now. George nodded. Little late. Ethan looked toward Atlas resting in the autumn sunlight. Late isn't the same as never. George smiled. No, he placed the letter inside his coat. I suppose it isn't. Travis Mercer changed too, not suddenly. Men like Travis rarely did anything suddenly, except get angry. He began by bringing lumber. No explanation. A flatbed truck simply appeared one Saturday morning, carrying enough rough-cut timber to frame the barn wall. Ethan walked outside. Mercer climbed down. I didn't order lumber. No, I can't pay for this. Didn't ask you to. Ethan folded his arms. Mercer looked toward the burned foundation. My father spent 30 years mad at this property. He paused. Figure I owe it a wall. George arrived an hour later, then 2 men from Pine Hollow, then the owner of the diner where Ethan had nearly fled from the crowd on his first day. By noon, 6 people were working. Ethan found himself standing beside the lumber pile, watching strangers rebuild something he had expected to repair alone. That feeling was harder to accept than help under fire. Megan noticed. She had come to examine Atlas and ended up carrying sandwiches onto the porch. You look uncomfortable. I am. Why? Ethan watched Mercer and George argue about whether a beam was level. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this many people. Megan handed him a sandwich. Try eating. He looked at her. Advanced therapy? Very. He ate. The barn went up piece by piece. New timber beside old stone, fresh nails driven into places where charred wood had been removed. Ethan preserved the section around Samuel Grady's benchmark exactly as investigators required. When the evidence hold was eventually released, he built a protective box over the marker rather than covering it again. A small brass plaque came later. Samuel Grady, benchmark, Original Valley Survey reference. Nothing dramatic. Grady would probably have preferred it that way. Winter arrived early. Snow settled over the bitterroots and transformed the farm. The dead-looking pasture became a white field. Smoke rose from the repaired chimney. Atlas's tracks appeared every morning between the porch and barn. His shoulder healed slowly. Megan finally cleared him for normal walking. Normal, she emphasized. Atlas stared at her. Not military normal, Ethan smiled. You're wasting your breath, Megan scratched the dog's gray muzzle. I know. She had become a regular visitor, sometimes for Atlas, sometimes with medical supplies, sometimes with no excuse at all. Ethan stopped asking which. His 12-month rehabilitation deadline arrived the following summer. Richard Caldwell was no longer behind the county desk. A different administrator came to inspect the property. She walked through the farmhouse, tested the water system, checked the repaired windows, roof, septic work, fencing, and barn. Ethan followed her with a strange nervousness. He had faced things in his life that should have made a county inspection meaningless. It didn't. Because this mattered differently, at the kitchen table she signed the final page. 96 acres, she said. Rehabilitation requirements satisfied. She slid the document toward him. The property is yours. Yours, Mr. Walker. Ethan stared at the deed. He had imagined the moment. He thought he might feel triumph. Instead, he felt quiet. Atlas rested beneath the table. Ethan reached down until his fingers touched the dog's neck. "Thank you," the administrator smiled. "Looks like you did the work." Ethan looked at Atlas, not alone. That evening, Ethan placed the deed inside the farmhouse, not beneath a floorboard, not inside the truck, not packed in a bag ready for departure. He framed it, then he hung it on the wall. Months passed. Life became ordinary. That surprised him most. Ordinary meant repairing a gate before breakfast. It meant coffee with George. Mercer complaining about hay prices. Megan leaving muddy boots by the kitchen door. It meant knowing which cashier in Pine Hollow asked too many questions, and which waitress quietly refilled his cup when the diner became crowded. Ethan still sat where he could see the entrance. Atlas still noticed when his breathing changed. PTSD did not disappear because a deed had his name on it. Some nights Ethan woke before the nightmare ended. Sometimes a slammed door in town tightened every muscle in his body. Sometimes he canceled plans because the world felt too loud. But something had changed. He stopped treating every difficult day as proof he had failed. He learned to tell Megan when he needed space instead of vanishing. He let George help without inventing a reason to repay him immediately. And when sleep became difficult for too many nights in a row, he spoke with a veterans counselor in Missoula instead of climbing into the pickup and driving until exhaustion chose a destination. Atlas remained his anchor, but Atlas was no longer the only anchor. That mattered. One October evening, nearly 2 years after Ethan first drove into Pine Hollow with $143 in his pocket, the valley turned gold beneath the setting sun. The rebuilt barn cast a long shadow across the pasture. Cattle grazed beyond the lower fence on land Ethan leased to George. The irrigation gate worked again. Smoke rose straight from the chimney, no wind. Ethan sat on the porch. Atlas lay beside him. The German shepherd's muzzle had become noticeably grayer. His injured shoulder sometimes stiffened in cold weather, and he no longer raced across the pasture the way he once had. But his eyes remained the same, alert, steady, watching Ethan even when Ethan thought he wasn't. Lights began appearing in Pine Hollow below, one, then another, then dozens. Ethan remembered his first night. A failing truck, a sagging farmhouse, a barn leaning toward collapse. A man who believed the safest thing he could do was remain unattached to anything he might lose. Everyone had expected Atlas to dig up treasure. That was how people told stories. A homeless veteran gets a free farm. His dog finds something buried. Surely there had to be gold, money, a fortune hidden underground. Instead, Atlas had found old metal, photographs, measurements, and the stubborn handwriting of a dead farmer. Nothing a pawnshop would buy, yet those things helped save families' land. They restored names. They reopened questions powerful people had considered buried. And they proved that Samuel Grady had not spent his final years fighting an imaginary enemy. But that still wasn't the greatest thing Atlas had uncovered. Ethan looked down. The dog raised his head. "You knew before I did." Atlas's ears shifted. Ethan smiled. Back when the truck was packed, he rested his hand against Atlas's neck. "You knew." The dog leaned into him. Ethan looked across the farm. There were tools in the barn with permanent places now, coffee cups in the kitchen that belonged to people who visited often enough to have favorites, a framed deed on the wall, Megan's spare gloves hanging beside the back door. George's tractor parked near the lower field, because he had said it was easier than driving it home. Evidence of belonging was everywhere, messy, ordinary, impossible to fit behind the seat of a pickup. That was the irony. In the beginning, Ethan had possessed almost nothing except an old truck and Atlas. Now the farmhouse stood warm behind him. The barn stood straight against the mountains. People in Pine Hollow knew when he missed breakfast at the diner. George would notice if his chimney stopped smoking. Megan would call if he didn't answer. People would notice if Ethan Walker disappeared. Once that thought would have terrified him. Now it made his throat tighten for another reason. Atlas lowered his head onto Ethan's boot. The last sunlight moved across his graying fur. Ethan rested both hands around the dog's neck. The farm had given them shelter. Samuel Grady's truth had given the valley justice. But neither was the real ending. The real ending was that a man who had spent years believing survival meant never needing anyone had finally learned something his dog had understood all along. A home wasn't the place where nothing could hurt you. It was the place worth returning to when something did. The mountains darkened. A porch light came on behind them. Ethan did not check the truck. He did not calculate how quickly he could pack. He did not wonder where he would sleep tomorrow. Atlas breathed slowly beneath his hand, and for the first time in years, tomorrow did not feel like another position Ethan had to survive. It felt like somewhere he intended to be. He looked across the pasture one last time. Then he looked down at the old soldier beside him. "Come on, partner." Atlas stood. Together they walked inside. And this time neither of them was leaving. Together they walked inside. And this time neither of them was leaving. If you believe some things are worth standing your ground for, type 1 in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. Justice may take the long road, but sometimes all it needs is someone stubborn enough to stay. And if stories about loyalty, dignity, and fighting for what's right still mean something to you, subscribe and stay with us for the next one.